The light in the room was grey and thin, the kind of light that comes through a shuttered window when the sky outside is heavy with the memory of rain but has not yet decided to let it fall. Aldric sat on a low stool near the hearth, though the fire was little more than a pile of white ash with a single red eye glowing in its center. The stool was made of 3 rough legs and a slab of split elm, and it had been his father's stool before it was his, and now the wood was dark and polished in the places where thighs and hands had rested over the span of a long lifetime. He was trying to mend a leather strap that had once belonged to a harness but now served no particular purpose other than being something to hold in his hands. The leather was stiff and cracked like the skin on his own knuckles, and the hole he had punched for the new buckle was just slightly too large, so that the tongue of the buckle wobbled loosely in its seat, and the whole thing felt unsteady and incomplete. The world outside the door had narrowed in ways that were difficult to name, but easy to feel, a sensation not unlike the way a path through a forest grows fainter and fainter with each passing season, until it is no longer a path at all, but only a suggestion of one beneath the fallen leaves. He could hear the sounds of the younger villagers working in the distant field, the low murmur of voices that did not carry words, but only the shape of them, the occasional sharp call of a man urging an ox to the left or the right, the thin clatter of a wooden rake being dragged across the stubbled earth. These sounds reached him as if from a great distance, even though the field was only a short walk past the alder trees and the stone wall, and he understood with a clarity that required no emotion that the distance was not measured in steps, but in something else entirely, something that had to do with the stiffness in his hips when he rose in the morning, and the way his breath came in shallow sips when he climbed even the gentlest slope. The strap in his hands had a smell, old leather and wood smoke, and the faint sourness of sweat from a horse that had been dead for more than 10 years, and he brought it close to his face not because he needed to see it better, but because the smell was a kind of map that led backward into a country he could still visit in his mind, even though his feet could no longer carry him there. His fingers moved slowly over the rough edge of the leather, feeling the tiny ridges and cracks like the lines on a dried riverbed, and he thought about the day he had first cut this piece from a larger hide, the way the knife had slid through the material with a sound like a soft whisper, the way his hands had been strong and sure and unthinking in their movements. Now his hands were neither strong nor sure, and every movement required a conscious decision, a small negotiation between what the mind wanted and what the body was willing to give. The knuckles on his right hand were swollen and misaligned, so that the fingers curved slightly inward toward the palm, and when he tried to grip the small iron needle he had threaded with coarse twine, he found that the needle slipped and wobbled and refused to go where he directed it. Outside the narrow window, the day was moving along without him, the way a river moves past a stone that juts from the bank, and he could track its progress by the shifting quality of the light on the opposite wall, a wall made of wattle and daub that had been patched so many times over the years that it resembled a quilt stitched together from mud and straw and the pale hair of the plaster that flaked away in thin sheets during the dry months of summer. The light that fell upon this wall began each morning as a cold grey rectangle that sat high and to the left, and then over the course of many hours it slid downward and to the right, growing warmer and softer as the sun climbed over the roof, and then descending again into a cool blue shadow as the afternoon gave way to evening. He had watched this progression so many times that he no longer needed to look at the wall to know exactly where the light would be at any given moment. And this knowledge was a small, quiet comfort, the kinds of comfort that comes from knowing a thing so completely that it requires no thought at all. His daughter-in-law moved through the room behind him, her steps quick and certain on the packed earth floor, and he did not turn to look at her because he knew the pattern of her movements as well as he knew the pattern of the light on the wall. She would go first to the shelf where the clay bowls were stacked, and then to the corner where the sack of barley meal sat, and then to the hearth where she would crouch and blow gently on the embers until a small flame licked up and caught the dry twigs she had arranged there. He heard the soft puff of her breath, and the crackle of the fire taking hold, and then the scrape of the iron pot being settled into its place over the flames, and then the sound of water being poured from the clay jug, a sound that was always the same, a low glugging followed by a splash, and then a steady trickle that diminished as the jug grew lighter. All of this happened behind him while he sat facing the wall with the useless leather strap in his lap and the needle resting loosely between his fingers, and he felt neither included nor excluded from the activity, merely adjacent to it, like a piece of furniture that had been pushed against the wall to make room for the necessary work of living. The ache in his lower back was a familiar companion, a dull and persistent presence that had moved in so gradually over the years that he could not remember a time when it had not been there, and it shifted and settled as he adjusted his weight on the hard stool, finding a new position that was slightly less uncomfortable than the last, but never truly comfortable. The cold that rose from the packed earth floor seeped upward through the thin soles of his shoes that had been made for him by a man who was now dead and buried in the churchyard beneath the yew tree, and the cold settled into the bones of his feet and ankles and calves and seemed to pool there, a slow accumulation of chill that no fire could fully dispel. He flexed his toes inside the shoes and felt the stiff resistance of the leather and the way his joints protested the small movement, and then he let them go still again and returned his attention to the strap and the needle and the small, frustrating problem of the hole that was too large for the buckle. Time passed in the way that it passes when there is nothing to mark it, a slow and even flow that was interrupted only by the small sounds of the house and the distant sounds of the village and the even more distant sounds of the world beyond the village, which might as well have been another country entirely for all the bearing it had on the small room and the old man and the leather strap. He thought about the harvest that was happening without him, the golden stalks of barley falling beneath the sickles of the younger men, the sheaves being bound and stacked and left to dry in the pale autumn sun, the grain being threshed and winnowed and carried in heavy sacks to the Lord's mill. And he could see all of it in his mind with perfect clarity, even though he would never again lift a sickle or feel the weight of a full sack across his shoulders. The knowledge of the work remained even after the capacity for the work had gone, and this was perhaps the strangest part of growing old, the way the mind continued to turn and plan and anticipate, while the body sat motionless on a three-legged stool and waited for the day to end. The fire in the hearth had grown stronger under the attention of his daughter-in-law, and the warmth of it reached him now in small waves that alternated with the cold draughts that slipped through the gaps around the door and the window, so that one side of his face was warm, while the other side remained cool, and this uneven distribution of heat was something he had grown so accustomed to that he no longer noticed it unless he made a deliberate effort to do so. The smell of the barley meal cooking in the pot was a smell that had been the background of his entire life, the smell of sustenance and survival, and the slow turning of the seasons, and it mingled with the smell of the leather and the smoke, and the faint earthy smell of the floor and the walls and the thatch above, creating a dense and layered atmosphere that was the smell of home and the smell of once. His grandson came through the door then, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 years, with cheeks that were red from the cold air and a collection of sticks clutched against his chest, sticks he had gathered from the edge of the wood for the evening fire, and he dropped them in a clattering pile near the hearth without looking at Aldric, without acknowledging his presence at all, except perhaps as another object in the room, the same way one does not a table or a bench. The boy said something to his mother in a high, clear voice, something about a fox he had seen near the alder trees, and his mother answered in a low murmur that Aldric could not quite catch, and then the boy was gone again, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud that sent a small puff of ash drifting up from the hearth. Aldric watched the ash rise and scatter and settle, and he thought about the fox, about its red coat and its quick nervous movements and its bright eyes that missed nothing, and he envied the fox its purpose and its speed in its place in the world, a place that was defined by the simple urgent needs of hunger and survival and the raising of young, a place that did not require sitting on a stool and waiting for the light to move across the wall. The needle slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a sound that was too small to be heard, and he bent forward slowly, very slowly, feeling each vertebrae in his back complain in its own particular voice as he reached down toward the packed earth where the needle lay half hidden in the shadow of his own foot. His fingers brushed against it and pushed it further away, and he had to shift his weight and reach again. And by the time he had retrieved the needle and straightened up again, his breath was coming faster, and there was a faint ringing in his ears that took a long moment to fade. He held the needle up to the light from the window and saw that the eye was bent and the tip was dull, and he understood that he would not be able to finish mending the strap. Not today, and perhaps not ever. and this understanding settled over him like a second blanket, heavy and warm, and not entirely unwelcome. He set the strap and the needle on the floor beside his stool, and folded his hands in his lap, and let his gaze rest on the wall, where the rectangle of light had now shifted so that its lower edge touched the top of the shelf that held the clay bowls. The light had a quality that was specific to autumn, a kind of golden thinness that was different from the thick, buttery light of summer and the pale, watery light of spring, and he could see the tiny motes of dust that drifted through it, countless particles suspended in the still air of the room, each one moving along its own slow and invisible current. He watched them for a long time, or perhaps it was only a short time, because time had become something that was difficult to measure with any accuracy, and he thought about the dust and where it came from and where it would go, and whether any of it had been part of the straw that had once covered the floor when he was a boy, or part of the wool from the sheep that had grazed on the hillside, or part of his own skin that had flaked away over the years and drifted into the corners of the room to wait for the end of all things. The sounds from the field had grown fainter now, and he knew that the work was winding down for the day, that the men would soon be gathering their tools and making their way back to their own cottages, their own hearths, their own bowls of barley meal. He could picture them walking along the path between the hedgerows, their shoulders bowed under the weight of the day's labor, their voices low and tired, their thoughts already turning toward rest and the small comforts of the evening. He had walked that path himself more times than he could count, in all weathers and all seasons, and he could still feel the particular way the ground sloped downward just past the old oak, the place where the path was always muddy in the spring and dusty in the summer, and slick with fallen leaves in the autumn, and the memory of walking it was so vivid that for a moment he forgot he was sitting on a stool, and felt instead the ground beneath his feet, and the cool air on his face, and the pleasant ache of muscles that had been used well, and fully but the packheit be with its din you work with sedable. But the moment passed, as all moments pass, and he was once again aware of the stool beneath him, and the wall before him, and the strap on the floor beside his foot. The rectangle of light had moved further down the wall, and was now beginning to soften and dim, and he knew that soon it would be gone entirely, and the room would be lit only by the glow of the hearth fire, a smaller and more intimate light that drew the world in close and pushed the darkness back against the walls. He did not mind the darkness, had never minded it, but he understood that the coming of night meant the end of another day in which he had done nothing of use, nothing that contributed to the survival of the household or the village or the world at large, and this understanding was like the cold that rose from the floor, a slow and steady presence that could not be argued with or wished away. His daughter-in-law came and stood beside him for a moment, and he felt her presence without looking up, felt the slight displacement of air and the warmth of her body, and the smell of the barley meal that clung to her clothing. She said nothing, and he said nothing, and after a moment she moved away again and began to set the bowls out on the low table near the hearth. The sound of the clay bowls being placed on the wood was a soft, hollow sound, a sound that meant food and warmth and the small rituals of evening, and he waited for the sound of his own bowl being filled, the sound of the ladle scraping against the bottom of the iron pot, the sound of his portion being determined by whatever remained after the younger, hungrier mouths had been fed. This was not a thing that was spoken of or even consciously acknowledged, but it was a thing that was known in the same way that the light on the wall was known, a fact of existence as certain and as neutral as the turning of the seasons. The evening settled over the cottage like a blanket being drawn up over a sleeping child, slowly and gently and with great care. The sounds from outside faded one by one, until there was nothing left but the rustle of the wind in the thatch and the distant, mournful call of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. The fire crackled and popped, and sent small sparks spiraling up into the darkness of the chimney, and the shadows on the walls shifted and danced in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that was almost like music, if music could be made of light and dark in the absence of sound. Aldric sat on his stool, and watched the shadows, and listened to the wind, and felt the warmth of the fire on one side of his face and the cool of the room on the other. And he thought about nothing in particular, and everything at once, the way an old man does when the world has narrowed to the size of a single room and the length of a single evening. He would sit there until it was time to lie down on the straw pallet in the corner, and then he would lie there and listen to the sounds of the others sleeping, the deep and regular breathing of the young and the strong, and he would wait for sleep to come to him as well, though it came more reluctantly now than it once had. A shy and skittish visitor that had to be coaxed and flattered and sometimes simply waited out, until the grey light began to seep back through the shuttered window, and another day began. And when the new day came, he would rise from the pallet and make his way slowly, stiffly, to the stool by the hearth, and he would pick up the leather strap and the bent needle, and he would try again, or he would not try again. And either way the world would continue to turn, and the light would continue to move across the wall, and the seasons would continue their slow and patient cycle, carrying him along like a leaf on the surface of a very wide and very slow river toward a destination that was not yet visible but was Silurus Hamter. The morning came without urgency, the grey light seeping through the shutters in the same slow and patient way it had done every morning that Aldric could remember, and he lay on his straw pallet listening to the sounds of the house waking around him. There was the soft scuff of bare feet on packed earth, the low murmur of voices that had not yet found their full strength for the day, the clink of the iron pot being lifted from its hook over the cold ashes, and beneath all of these the steady, distant breathing of the oxen in their byre, a sound so deep and so constant that it was more like a vibration in the ground than a sound in the air. He had listened to oxen breathing for more than 60 years, first as a boy lying beside his father in the loft, then as a young man with his own household and his own team, and now as an old man whose only connection to the great beasts was the sound they made in the darkness before dawn. He rose slowly, as he did everything now, swinging his legs over the edge of the pallet and pausing to let the stiffness in his back settle into something manageable, before he pushed himself upright, with one hand braced against the rough wall. The straw had left marks on his cheek and his arm, small indentations that would fade over the course of the morning but never entirely, the way the impressions of a lifetime fade but never entirely disappear from the shape of a person. He pulled his woolen tunic over his head and felt the familiar weight of it settle on his shoulders, a garment that had been patched and repatched so many times that the original fabric was now only a memory held together by newer, stronger threads. And he made his way to the stool by the hearth where a bowl of thin porridge had been left for him, still warm from the pot. The porridge had the same taste it had always had, a taste that was not quite flavour, but rather the absence of hunger, a bland and comforting presence that filled the stomach and asked nothing in return. He ate it slowly, feeling the warmth travel down his throat and spread outward through his chest. And while he ate, he listened to the sounds from outside that told him the day's work was already beginning without him. The younger men were gathering near the field gate, their voices carrying in the still morning air with a clarity that would fade as the day warmed and the wind rose. And among those voices he could pick out the particular tone and rhythm of his son Edric, a voice that was like his own voice had been 30 years ago, deeper now and more sure of itself, but still carrying the same cadence that marked it as belonging to this family and this village and this narrow strip of land, between the river and the wood. He finished the porridge and set the bowl on the floor beside the stool and sat for a while longer, feeling the warmth of the fire on his face and the cold of the floor on his face, the familiar division of sensation that had become the background of his days. There was no need for him to hurry, no task that required his presence or his hands, and this absence of necessity was a strange and weighty thing, like a pocket of air trapped beneath the surface of a pond, visible and real, but serving no purpose that anyone could name. He could stay on the stool until the light moved to the middle of the wall, or he could rise and walk to the door and stand in the threshold and watch the work begin, and neither choice would make any difference to the course of the day or the turning of the season or the slow, patient progress of the world toward whatever destination awaited it. After a time he rose, because sitting became more uncomfortable than standing, and he walked to the door and pushed it open and stepped out into the thin, cool air of the autumn morning. The light was brighter here than inside the cottage, a pale gold that lay over everything like a fine dust, and he blinked against it for a moment when his eyes adjusted and the shapes of the world resolved themselves into familiar forms. The yard was packed, earth-worn smooth by countless feet and hooves and the dragging of heavy things, and it sloped gently down toward the gate that opened onto the lane. and beyond the gate he could see the tops of the alder trees and the grey stone wall and the brown expanse of the field that had been turned and planted and harvested by his own hands for more years than he could now easily count. He did not walk to the gate, not at first because walking required an effort that he preferred to delay, but instead he stood in the doorway with one shoulder resting against the frame and let his gaze travel across the yard and down the lane and out into the field where the work of the day was beginning. The plough had been brought out from the shed where it was stored during the wet months, and it stood near the edge of the field like a dark and patient animal waiting to be put to use. It was a heavy thing, the plough, made of oak and iron, and the accumulated weight of all the seasons it had been dragged through the resistant earth. And its surfaces were dark with age and use, the wood polished to a deep brown shine where hands had gripped it, the iron blade worn thin and bright at the cutting edge, but dark and pitted elsewhere, with the rust that came and went with the rain and the dry spells. Aldric looked at the plough and remembered the day it had been made. Or rather, he remembered the day his own father had pointed to it and explained how his grandfather had shaped the beam from a single trunk of oak that had grown at the edge of the northern wood. An oak that had been old even then and had taken 3 men and a team of oxen to drag from the forest floor. The story had been told to him many times, the way such stories are told in families where the past is the only wealth that accumulates rather than diminishes. And he had told it himself to Edric when Edric was a boy, small enough to ride on the plough beam while the oxen pulled it through the soft spring soil. The story was still there in his mind, whole and complete, and waiting to be told again. But there was no one to tell it to now, no one who had not already heard it, more times than they cared to count. And so it remained in his mind like the plough itself remained in the shed during the winter, waiting for a season that might never come. Edric was walking toward the plough now, his movements unhurried but purposeful, the movements of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done and exactly how long it would take to do it. He was broader through the shoulders than Aldric had been at his age, and his hands were larger and his back straighter, and he walked with the easy confidence of someone who had never known a day when his body refused to do what his mind asked of it. He stopped beside the plough and laid one hand on the beam, and the gesture was so familiar that Aldric felt it in his own palm. The smooth warmth of the polished oak, the slight give of the wood under pressure, the way the grain ran in long straight lines from the handle to the blade. He had laid his own hand on that same spot thousands of times, at the beginning of a day's work and at the end of it, and the memory of the sensation was so clear that for a moment he was not standing in the doorway, but standing beside the plough with his hand on the beam and the smell of fresh earth rising around him. The oxen were brought from the byre, 2 large brown animals with patient eyes and slow, ponderous movements, and they stood while the yoke was lowered onto their necks and the traces were fastened to the plough. Their breath came out in white plumes that hung in the cold air for a moment before dissolving, and their flanks twitched occasionally against the flies that were scarce now in the autumn, but still persistent enough to be a nuisance. The younger of the 2 oxen was an animal that Aldric did not know well, having been bought the previous spring after the old ox had finally grown too lame to work, and he looked at its legs and its chest, and the way it held its head, and tried to see in it the qualities that would make it a good worker or a difficult one. But his eyes could no longer read the animals the way they once had, and he found that he did not much care either way. The oxen would do what oxen did, and the plough would do what ploughs did, and the field would be turned and planted and harvested, whether he watched it happen or not. Edric took his place behind the plough and gripped the handles, and the oxen leaned into their yoke and began to move, and the blade bit into the soil and turned it over in a long, dark ribbon that curled away from the mouldboard like water curling away from the prow of a boat. The sound was a sound that Aldric knew as well as he knew his own breathing, the soft sigh of the earth parting, the creak of the wooden beam under strain, the steady clop of the oxen's hooves on the soft ground, the occasional low word from Edric to guide them left or right. He watched the furrow lengthen behind the plough, straight and true and deep enough to bury the stubble of the previous crop and expose the darker, richer soil beneath, and he saw that Edric's furrow was as straight as his own had ever been, perhaps straighter, and this observation produced in him a feeling that was too complex to be called pride and too quiet to be called sorrow, a feeling that was simply the recognition of a thing that was true and could not be changed. The morning wore on, and the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened, and then began to lengthen again on the other side of noon. Aldric had moved from the doorway to a low stone at the edge of the yard, a stone that had been placed there long ago for no particular reason that anyone could remember, and he sat on it with his hands resting on his thighs and watched the slow, rhythmic progress of the plough back and forth across the field. Each pass took a certain amount of time that he could have measured if he had wanted to, but he did not want to, because measuring the time would have meant acknowledging that the time was passing and that he was spending it in stillness while others spent it in motion, and this was a distinction that he preferred to leave unexamined. The stone was cold beneath him, and the cold seeped upward through his clothing and into his flesh and bones, and after a while he could no longer tell where the cold of the stone ended and the cold of his own body began. The plough reached the far end of the field and turned, a maneuver that required Edric to lift the blade clear of the soil and guide the oxen in a wide, slow arc until they were facing back the way they had come. And during this turn there was a moment when the plough was motionless and the oxen were catching their breath and Edric was wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. And in that moment Aldric could see the whole of his son's life laid out before him, the furrows in the field. He could see the years of work that would wear down the handles of the plough until they fit only Edric's grip and no other. The seasons of planting and harvesting, and the slow accumulation of small wisdoms about the land and the weather and the animals, the gradual stiffening of the joints and the deepening of the lines around the eyes, and at the end of it all, the same stone at the edge of the yard where an old man would sit and watch a younger man turn the soil that had once been his, to turn. The thought was not a sad one. Or if it was sad, it was a sadness so old and so familiar that it had lost its sharp edges and become something smooth and worn, like a stone that has been tumbled in a river for 1,000 years. It was simply the shape of things, the way the land lay, and the way the water ran, and the way one generation gave way to the next, with no more ceremony than the turning of a furrow at the edge of a field. He had been the young man once, and his father had been the old man on the stone, and his father's father before that, and the line stretched back into a darkness that had no names and no stories, only the fact of its existence and the certainty of its continuation. The sun was lower now, and the light had taken on the golden quality that came in the late afternoon of autumn days, a light that seemed to make everything more vivid and more distant at the same time, the way a memory becomes clearer even as it recedes further into the past. The shadows of the alder trees stretched across the lane and touched the edge of the yard, and the air had grown cooler and carried with it the smell of wood smoke from the cottage chimneys and the faint, sweet smell of the turned earth from the field. Edric had finished the last furrow and was leading the oxen back toward the byre, their heads low and their steps slow with the weight of the day's labour, and the plough stood alone at the edge of the field where it would remain until the next day's work began. Aldric watched his son approach, and as Edric drew nearer he could see the sheen of sweat on his face, and the way his tunic was darkened with moisture across the shoulders and down the back, and he could hear the sound of his breathing, deep and even and unlaboured despite the hours of work. Edric did not look at him as he passed, or if he did look it was only a glance, the kind of glance one gives to a familiar landmark that has been there so long it no longer requires acknowledgement. He led the oxen into the byre, and there was the sound of the yoke being lifted and the traces being unfastened, and the animals settling into their stalls with heavy, grunting sighs. And then Edric came out again and walked to the well and drew up a bucket of water and drank from it directly, the water running down his chin and dripping onto his chest. When he had finished drinking, he set the bucket down and stood for a moment looking out toward the field, where the dark lines of the furrows caught the last of the golden light, and held it like a promise. His hands hung at his sides and his shoulders were relaxed, and his whole posture was one of quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of a day's work completed and done well. Aldric knew that posture because he had worn it himself 1,000 times, had felt it settle into his bones at the end of a long day in the field. The pleasant ache of tired muscles, and the knowledge that the earth had been turned, and the seed would be sown, and the cycle would continue for another year. He did not feel that satisfaction now, sitting on the cold stone with the chill seeping upward through his body and the evening coming on. But he remembered it clearly enough that the memory was almost a substitute for the thing itself. Edric turned and walked toward the cottage, and as he passed the stone where Aldric sat, he slowed for a moment, and his eyes met his father's eyes, and something passed between them that was too small and too quiet to be called communication, but was nonetheless understood by both of them. It was an acknowledgement of the day, of the work, of the transfer that had taken place without any words being spoken, the quiet and unceremonious passing of the plough from one pair of hands to another. Then Edric continued into the cottage, and Aldric heard the low murmur of voices as he greeted his wife and children, and the sounds of the evening meal being prepared began to drift out through the open door. Aldric remained on the stone for a while longer, watching the light fade from the field and the shadows deepen in the furrows, until the whole expanse was a single dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. The plough was only a silhouette now, a dark form against the darker earth, and it would remain there through the night and be waiting when the morning came and the work began again. He thought about the plough and the field and the hands that would hold the handles tomorrow and the next day and all the days after that, and he thought about his own hands that had held them for so long and now held nothing but the cold surface of the stone and the empty air. The thought was not a complaint, not even a regret, but simply an observation of the way things were, the way the river flowed and the seasons turned, and the old gave way to the young with the same quiet inevitability that the day gave way to the night. He rose from the stone, feeling the stiffness in his hips and knees, and the way his back protested the movement after sitting so long in the cold, and he walked slowly back toward the cottage where the fire would be warm and the porridge would be thin and the voices of his family would fill the small room with the sounds of a life that continued around him, and without him, and in spite of him. The door closed behind him, and the night settled over the yard and the field and the plough that waited in the darkness, and nothing had changed, and everything had changed, and the world moved on in its slow and patient way toward the next day and the next season and the next turn of the great wheel that carried them all along together. The world had shrunk to the size of the hearth and the small circle of warmth that radiated outward from the flames. A circle that was no more than 4 or 5 feet across before it faltered and gave way to the permanent chill that lived in the corners of the room and along the walls and beneath the door where the wind found its way in thin, persistent streams. Aldric sat on his stool within this circle. His stool that had been moved from its old position against the wall to a new position closer to the fire, a concession to the season that had been made without discussion or ceremony one afternoon when his daughter-in-law had simply lifted the stool and carried it nearer to the flames and set it down again and walked away without a word. The new position meant that the light from the fire fell directly on his face and hands, a warm orange glow that was the only color in a room that had otherwise faded to shades of gray and brown and the deep black of the shadows that gathered in the rafters. The autumn had given way to winter with the same quiet inevitability that characterized all changes in this place, a gradual cooling of the air and a shortening of the days and a hardening of the ground, until one morning he had woken to find a thin skin of ice on the water bucket and his breath hanging in the air above the pallet like a small pale ghost. The work in the fields had ended weeks ago, the last of the barley gathered and threshed and stored, the animals brought into the bye, where their collective warmth would help them survive the cold months, the plough and the tools cleaned and put away in the shed to wait for the spring that was still only a distant promise. The village had settled into the slow rhythm of winter, a rhythm that was less about doing and more about enduring, about keeping the fire lit and the porridge pot filled and the cold at bay for one more day and then another until the first green shoots appeared in the frozen earth. The fire was a living thing that required constant attention, and this attention had become Aldric's primary occupation, the one small task that remained within his power to perform. He fed it with sticks and twigs and the occasional larger piece of wood that Edric brought in from the pile outside the door, and he watched the flames consume each offering with a hunger that never diminished, transforming the solid matter into heat and light, and the fine grey ash that accumulated in the fine grey ash that accumulated in a soft pile beneath the grate. The process was slow and repetitive and demanded nothing of him except patience and a willingness to sit and watch and wait, and these were qualities that he possessed in abundance. Now that the other qualities, the strength and the speed and the sureness of hand, had slipped away from him like water through fingers that could no longer close tightly enough to hold them. His daughter-in-law moved around him in the course of her daily work, and her movements had become so familiar that he could track her position in the room without looking, could tell by the sound she made whether she was at the shelf or the table or the doorway, whether she was stirring the pot or sweeping the floor or folding the rough woolen blankets that were taken out at night and put away again in the morning. She spoke to him occasionally, short sentences about the weather or the condition of the fire or the meal that would be ready soon, and he answered with single words or small nods, and this exchange of sounds was less a conversation than a form of mutual acknowledgement, a way of confirming that they both still occupied the same space and the same time and the same slow progression of days. There was no affection in these exchanges and no hostility either, only the comfortable neutrality that develops between people who have shared a small space for many years and have long since exhausted all the things that need to be said. The hours passed in a way that was difficult to describe to anyone who had not experienced them, a way that was both very fast and very slow at the same time, like watching a cloud move across the sky and being unable to perceive its motion while also knowing that it had shifted from one side of the window to the other over the course of the afternoon. He would look at the fire and see that a particular stick had burned down to half its original length, and then he would look again after what felt like only a moment and see that the stick was gone entirely and the flames were licking at a new piece of wood that he did not remember placing there. The gaps in his attention were smooth and seamless, with no clear boundaries between waking and dozing, and the strange middle state that was neither one nor the other, but a kind of suspension in which the mind drifted and the body remained still, and the world outside the circle of firelight became vague and unimportant. There was a fishing net that hung from a peg on the wall near the door, a net that he had made himself many years ago and had used in the river during the summers when the fish were running and the days were long and warm. The net had not been used in several seasons now because the walk to the river was longer than his legs could comfortably manage, and the act of standing in the cold water and casting the weighted line required a strength and a balance that he no longer possessed. The net hung on its peg and gathered dust, and the fine ash that drifted up from the fire, and sometimes he would take it down and spread it across his lap and examine the knots and the mesh and the places where the twine had frayed and needed repair. He had attempted to mend it once early in the winter, had found the small bone needle and a length of spare twine, and had set about the careful work of tying new knots to replace the old ones that had worn through. But his fingers had refused to cooperate, had fumbled and slipped and turned the simple task into an exercise in frustration that had ended with the net being returned to its peg and the needle being set aside, and a long period of stillness in which he had stared at the fire and felt the weight of all the things he could no longer do pressing down on him. The net remained on the peg now, and he looked at it often but did not take it down, and the dust continued to gather, and the frayed places continued to fray, and nothing was done about any of it, because there was nothing to be done that he was capable of doing. This acceptance was not a peaceful one, not the serene resignation that the priests spoke of in their sermons about the blessed release from earthly cares, but rather a kind of tired surrender to the simple fact of limitation, a recognition that the body had become a cage whose bars grew closer together with each passing season. The sounds of the cottage were a constant presence that filled the long silences between the crackling of the fire and the occasional word from his daughter-in-law. There was the rustle of the thatch overhead when the wind blew, a soft and whispery sound like the turning of many pages in a book that would never be read. There was the scratching of the mice in the walls, small and furtive sounds that came and went and were never seen but always heard, a reminder that the cottage was shared with other lives that went about their own business in the dark spaces between the wattle and the daub. There was the drip of water from the eaves when the snow on the roof melted during the brief warmth of the afternoon, a slow and rhythmic sound that marked the passage of time like a clock made of water and gravity, and the patient work of the sun. There was the creak of the wooden beam that supported the roof, a sound that came at irregular intervals and seemed to have no cause that anyone could identify, a sound that had been there for as long as Aldric could remember and would probably be there long after he was gone. His grandson came and went throughout the day, a small whirlwind of motion and noise that would burst through the door with a gust of cold air and a flurry of words, and then disappear again, just as suddenly, leaving behind only the memory of warmth and the lingering smell of the outdoors that clung to his clothing. The boy had learned not to expect anything from the old man by the fire, had learned through the quiet lessons of daily life that his grandfather was a part of the room now, rather than a part of the family, a fixture that could be acknowledged or ignored without consequence. Sometimes the boy would sit on the floor near the hearth and play with a collection of small stones or a carved wooden figure that had been passed down through the generations, and Aldric would watch him from the corner of his eye and remember the way his own hands had once carved a similar figure for Edric when Edric was that age. The way the knife had moved through the soft wood and the shavings had curled and fallen, and the shape of a horse or a dog had emerged slowly from the formless block. The memory was pleasant but distant, like a story that had been told to him about someone else, and he did not try to hold on to it when it faded back into the general haze of the past. The cold was a more reliable companion than any person, a constant presence that never left and never changed and never asked for anything except to be endured. It came up through the floor and through the walls and through the gaps around the door and the shutters, and it settled into his bones and his joints and the deep places of his body where no fire could reach. His hands were always cold now, even when he held them close to the flames until the skin grew tight and pink with the heat, and his feet were cold inside his shoes, and his shoes were cold inside his shoes, and his shoes were cold inside the thin layer of straw that covered the floor. The cold was not painful in any dramatic way, but was rather a dull and persistent ache that had become so familiar that he only noticed it when it shifted or intensified. The way one only notices the sound of the wind when it changes direction or grows louder. He slept in short intervals throughout the day and night, a pattern of rest that had no pattern at all but was simply a series of lapses into unconsciousness that occurred whenever his body decided it could no longer sustain the effort of remaining awake. The sleep was light and easily disturbed, a thin veil that barely separated him from the sounds and sensations of the room, and he would often wake without knowing whether minutes or hours had passed, would open his eyes to find the fire at a different stage of its slow consumption, and the light at a different angle on the wall, and his daughter-in-law in a different position, or performing a different task. The discontinuity was not troubling, because there was nothing in his life that required continuity, no project that demanded sustained attention, no responsibility that would suffer from his absence. He was simply there, a part of the room, and the room continued around him whether he was aware of it or not. One afternoon, when the light through the small window had taken on the pale, watery quality that meant snow was coming, he found himself looking at his own hands, with an attention that he had not given them in a very long time. They rested on his thighs, palms down, and he studied them as if they belonged to someone else, which in a way they did, because the hands he remembered having were not these hands, were younger and stronger and capable of things that these hands could no longer dream of doing. The skin was thin and loose and covered with spots that had appeared gradually over the years, spots of darker brown against the pale background, and the veins stood out in blue ridges that traced complex patterns across the backs of his hands and up into his wrists. The knuckles were swollen and knobby, and the fingers had a slight curve to them that had not been there before, a bending inward toward the palms that made it difficult to straighten them fully or to grip anything with any real force. He turned his hands over and looked at the palms, at the lines that were said to tell a person's fortune, and he wondered what fortune these lines had foretold when they were first examined by his mother, or his grandmother, or whoever it was that had looked at the hands of a newborn child, and pronounced some vague prediction about a long life or a happy marriage or a prosperous farm. The lines were deeper now and crossed by smaller lines that had appeared over the years, a network of creases and folds that seemed to map a territory he had traveled but could no longer remember in any detail. He lowered his hands back to his thighs and looked at the fire instead, at the way the flames moved and shifted and consumed the wood in a process that was both destructive and creative, turning the solid matter into heat and light and the fine ash that would eventually be returned to the earth. The fire did not care about his hands or his fortune or his place in the world, and this indifference was strangely comforting, a reminder that the great processes of the universe continued without reference to the small concerns of a single old man in a single small cottage in a single small forgotten village. The flames would burn and the ash would fall, and the winter would give way to spring, and the spring to summer, and the summer to autumn. And all of this would happen whether he was there to witness it or not. And this knowledge was a kind of freedom, a release from the burden of mattering. The snow began to fall in the late afternoon. a soft and silent accumulation of white that covered the yard and the lane and the field beyond. And the quality of the light in the room changed again, became softer and more diffuse as the snow reflected the last of the day's brightness back up into the sky. His daughter-in-law came and stood by the door for a moment and looked out at the falling snow, and made a small sound in her throat that might have been concern or might have been satisfaction. And then she closed the door and went back to her work, and the room settled into the deeper quiet that always accompanied a snowfall. A quiet that was more than just the absence of sound, but was a positive presence in itself, a blanket of stillness that wrapped around the cottage and held it close. Aldric watched the snow through the small window, or rather he watched the light that came through the small window, and the way that light was changed by the snow that was piling up on the sill outside. And he thought about all the snowfalls he had seen in his life. The storms that had buried the village for days, and the light dustings that had melted by noon. The snows of his childhood that had seemed magical, and the snows of his middle years that had seemed magical, and the snows of his middle years that seemed neither one nor the other, but snart with slove tived that it knive of the timmer ruberadisselkin. He could not count the snowfalls, and he did not try, but he could feel them all together in his memory, like the layers of sediment in a riverbank, each one distinct but indistinguishable, each one a small mark on the long timeline of a life that was now measured less in events than in the quiet accumulation of days. The evening came early, as it always did in winter, and the fire was built up with larger pieces of wood that would burn slowly through the night and keep the worst of the cold at bay until morning. The family gathered around the hearth to eat their meal, a thick porridge with a few pieces of dried meat that had been soaked and softened, and Aldric received his portion in his clay bowl and ate it slowly, while the others talked in low voices about the snow and the animals and the supplies that would need to last until the weather cleared. He listened to their voices without following the words, letting the sound wash over him, like the sound of the fire or the sound of the wind, a familiar and undemanding presence that asked nothing of him and expected nothing in return. When the meal was finished and the bowls had been collected and cleaned, the family settled into their places for the night. The younger children curled together on a pallet near the warmest part of the hearth, and Edric and his wife on the larger pallet against the far wall. Aldric remained on his stool for a while longer, watching the fire settle into the slow, steady burn that would carry it through the hours of darkness, and then he rose with the familiar protest of his joints and made his way to his own pallet in the corner where the cold was deepest. But the darkness was most complete. He lay down and pulled the thin blanket up to his chin and listened to the sounds of the cottage settling around him, the creaks and rustles and the soft breathing of the others, and he waited for sleep to come and take him away from the small circle of warmth and the long hours of stillness, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after would be the same as tomorrow, a long and unbroken chain of days that led nowhere in particular, but simply continued one after another until they stopped. The winter had settled into a long stretch of wet weather that was neither cold enough to freeze the ground solid nor warm enough to dry the mud that clung to every surface, and the result was a pervasive dampness that seeped into the cottage and into the bones of anyone who spent their days within its walls. Aldric had come to know this dampness intimately over the course of the past weeks, had learned to recognize its particular qualities and the ways it manifested in different parts of his body, and this knowledge had become a kind of language that his body spoke to him constantly, a low and insistent murmur of complaint that never entirely fell silent. The dampness was not a single sensation, but a collection of related sensations that varied according to the time of day and the state of the weather, and the position of his body on the stool or the pallet, and he had grown so accustomed to cataloguing these variations that he did it without conscious thought, the way a farmer notes the direction of the wind or the color of the sky without needing to stop and consider what the observations might mean. The first and most constant of the sensations lived in his hands, specifically in the knuckles of his right hand, where the swelling had settled in years ago and never fully retreated. The dampness made the swelling worse, or rather it made the stiffness that accompanied the swelling more pronounced, so that when he woke in the morning his fingers were curled inward like the claws of a dead bird, and it required several minutes of slow, patient flexing before they would open far enough to grip anything at all. The process of opening his hand was a small ritual that he performed each morning while still lying on the pallet, working the fingers one by one and then all together, feeling the resistance in the joints and the strange creaking sensation that was not quite a sound, but was somehow audible to him alone. A deep internal grinding that spoke of surfaces that no longer moved smoothly against one another, but caught and scraped and complained with every small adjustment. By the time he had achieved enough mobility to push himself upright, the dampness had usually found its way into his other hand as well, and the whole process would need to be repeated, a slow and methodical negotiation between the will to move and the body's reluctance to cooperate. The dampness had a particular way of finding the places where old injuries had healed imperfectly, and his left shoulder was one such place, a joint that had been wrenched many years ago when an ox had shied at a snake and jerked the plough handle from his grip and twisted his arm behind him at an angle that arms were not meant to go. The injury had healed over time, as injuries do when one is young and strong and cannot afford to be idle. But the healing had left behind a deep and permanent ache that flared up whenever the weather turned wet and cold. The ache was not sharp, but was instead a dull and throbbing presence that radiated outward from the shoulder joint and down into the upper arm and up into the base of his neck. A sensation that was less like pain and more like a heavy weight that had been draped over that side of his body and could not be shifted no matter how he adjusted his position. He had learned to favor the shoulder without thinking about it, to reach for things with his right hand even when the left would have been more convenient, to sleep on his right side with his left arm tucked close against his chest. And these accommodations had become so automatic that he only noticed them when he tried to do something that required both arms equally, and found that the left one refused to rise above a certain height. The dampness also inhabited his lower back in a way that was different from the shoulder, but related to it, a deep and persistent ache that sat just above his hips and seemed to connect the two sides of his body with a bridge of discomfort. This ache was at its worst when he had been sitting on the stool for too long without moving, and it would build gradually from a barely perceptible presence to a grinding insistence that could no longer be ignored, at which point he would rise slowly and walk the few steps to the door and back again, feeling the muscles and bones shift and settle into a slightly different arrangement that would hold the ache at bay for another span of time. The walking itself was not easy because the dampness had also found its way into his knees, both of them, and they protested any movement that required them to bear his full weight, sending sharp little reminders up through his thighs with each step that his body was no longer the reliable instrument it had once been. The knees made a sound when he bent them, a soft popping or clicking that was audible even to his ears, which had grown less sharp over the years, and the sound was always the same, a small announcement that the machinery of his body was wearing down in the way that all machinery eventually wears down. The dampness did not confine itself to his joints, but spread outward into the surrounding tissues, into the muscles of his calves that cramped unexpectedly in the middle of the night and woke him from his thin sleep with a sudden tightness that took long minutes to ease, into the soles of his feet that ached with a dull persistence that made him want to press them against something warm and solid, into the small of his back where the skin itself seemed to grow more sensitive to the cold and the wet and the rough texture of his woolen tunic. He had become a collection of aches and pains and small discomforts that each demanded their share of his attention, and together they formed a chorus that played continuously in the background of his awareness, a song with no melody and no rhythm, but with an endless capacity for variation and repetition. The weather outside contributed its own voice to this chorus, a constant accompaniment of rain and wind and the occasional wet snow that melted as soon as it touched the ground and added to the general saturation of the world. The rain fell in a steady rhythm on the thatch above his head, a sound that was soft and insistent and seemed to go on forever, and the water found its way through the small gaps and imperfections in the roof and dripped into the clay pots that his daughter-in-law had placed at strategic points around the room. Each drip had its own tone and its own timing, a high plink from the pot near the door, and a lower plunk from the pot beneath the window, and a soft pat from the pot in the corner that caught the slow seepage from the wall, and these sounds together formed a kind of music that was as much a part of the winter as the cold and the dampness and the endless grey light. He listened to the drips, and counted them sometimes without meaning to, following the pattern until it shifted, or he lost track, or his attention drifted away to some other sensation that demanded to be noticed. The dampness in the walls was a thing that could be seen as well as felt, a dark staining that spread upward from the floor and outward from the corners and marked the boundaries between the dry parts of the room and the parts that were slowly succumbing to the persistent moisture. The wattle and daub had never been entirely waterproof, had always allowed a certain amount of the outside to find its way inside, but the long weeks of rain had overwhelmed its capacity to resist, and now the walls themselves seemed to be weeping, a slow and silent grief that no one could comfort. The smell of the damp was a smell that Aldric had known all his life, a musty and earthy odor that was not unpleasant in itself, but carried with it associations of decay and decline, and the slow return of all things to the soil from which they had come. It was the smell of the grave, he thought sometimes. Or perhaps it was only the smell of an old house in a wet winter, and the distinction between these two things was smaller than it had once seemed. His breathing had become a matter of attention in a way that it had never been before, a process that had once been automatic and unremarkable, but now required a certain amount of monitoring and adjustment. The damp air was heavy and thick, and seemed to resist being drawn into his lungs, and when it did enter, it brought with it a tightness in his chest that was not quite pain, but was also not quite comfort, a sensation of constriction that made each breath a small effort rather than the effortless exchange of gases that it had been throughout his younger years. The breath came out again with a slight wheeze that was audible in the quiet of the room, a soft and whispery sound that caught on some obstruction deep in his throat and emerged transformed, thinner and less substantial than the breath that had gone in. He had grown used to the sound and no longer noticed it unless he was very still and very quiet, at which point it would present itself to his awareness, and he would listen to it for a while and think about the mechanism of breathing and the fragility of the structures that made it possible, and the certainty that one day the mechanism would simply stop and the sound would cease, and the dampness and the cold and the aches would no longer matter at all. The dampness affected his sleep in ways that were subtle but cumulative, making it difficult to find a position that was comfortable enough to allow the transition into unconsciousness. He would lie on his right side with his left arm tucked close and his knees slightly bent, and he would wait for sleep to come. And while he waited, he would become aware of the pressure of his own body against the straw pallet, the way his hip bone pressed into the thin padding and created a point of discomfort that grew more insistent the longer he lay still. He would shift slightly and find a new position that relieved the pressure on his hip but created a new pressure on his shoulder. And then he would shift again and find that his knees were now at an angle that promised a cramp if he did not move them, and this small and endless negotiation would continue until he finally drifted off, or until the grey light began to seep through the shutters and he realized that another night had passed without the deep and restful sleep that his body craved but could no longer achieve. The mornings were the worst time for the aches, or perhaps it was more accurate to say that the mornings were the time when the aches announced themselves most forcefully after the relative stillness of the night. He would wake with his body stiff and uncooperative, every joint and muscle sending its own particular signal of protest as he began the slow process of rising from the pallet. His back would complain first, a deep and grinding ache that made him want to remain horizontal forever, and then his knees would add their voices as he swung his legs over the edge, and then his hands would remind him of their existence as he pushed himself upright and felt the swollen knuckles refuse to close properly around the edge of the pallet for support. The process of standing was a series of small negotiations and accommodations, a careful distribution of weight and a testing of each joint before committing to the next movement, and by the time he was fully upright and shuffling toward the stool by the hearth, he felt as though he had already completed a full day's work. The fire helped, or at least it seemed to help, though the warmth was never quite enough to penetrate to the deep places where the aches lived. The surface of his skin would grow warm and even hot if he sat close enough, and his warmth was pleasant in its own way, a temporary distraction from the deeper discomforts that continued beneath the surface like the slow movement of water through the soil far underground. He would hold his hands out toward the flames and feel the heat on his palms and the backs of his fingers, and for a few moments the stiffness in his knuckles would ease slightly, and the fingers would flex more readily. But the relief was always temporary, and the stiffness would return as soon as he withdrew his hands from the warmth. The fire could not reach his back or his knees or the deep ache in his shoulder, and so these continued their patient complaint while his hands enjoyed their brief respite, a division of attention that he had learned to accept without resentment. The dampness and the aches and the long hours of stillness had combined to create a kind of fog in his mind, a haziness that made it difficult to hold on to thoughts for any length of time before they slipped away and were replaced by other thoughts or by no thoughts at all. He would find himself staring at the wall and realize that he had no idea how long he had been sitting there or what he had been thinking about, and the realization would drift away again before it could establish itself as anything more than a passing observation. The fog was not unpleasant, was in fact rather soothing in its way, a soft and undemanding state that required nothing of him and expected nothing in return, and he had come to welcome it as a relief from the sharper awareness of his physical limitations. Sometimes he would try to remember what it had felt like to move without pain, to rise from a pallet without a symphony of complaints, to walk across a field without measuring each step against the protests of his knees and his back and his lungs. But the memory was distant and faded, and seemed to belong to someone else entirely, someone who had inhabited this same body when it was younger and stronger and more forgiving of the demands placed upon it. He could recall the fact of having moved without pain, but could not recapture the sensation itself, the way one can remember that a particular food was delicious without being able to taste it again, and this inability was not frustrating, but was simply another aspect of the condition in which he found himself, a condition that was defined as much by what had been lost as by what remained. The rain continued to fall, and the dampness continued to seep, and the aches continued their quiet chorus, and Aldric sat on his stool by the fire and listened to it all with the patient attention of someone who has no choice but to listen and no desire to do otherwise. The language of his body was a language he had learned over many years and now spoke fluently, a vocabulary of twinges and throbs and dull, persistent pressures that communicated the state of his physical self with perfect clarity and required no interpretation. He understood what his knees were telling him about the weather, and what his hands were telling him about the cold, and what his breathing was telling him about the weight of the damp air in his chest. And he accepted these communications without argument or complaint, the way one accepts the news that the river has risen, or the wind has shifted, or the season has turned. The aches were simply there, a part of him as much as his name or his memories or the stool on which he sat, and they would be there until they were not, until the body finally fell silent and the long conversation between the dampness and the bones came to its natural and inevitable end. The spring arrived without announcement, the way it always did in this part of the world. A gradual softening of the air and a lengthening of the light and a change in the smell of the earth that was impossible to describe, but instantly recognizable to anyone who had spent their life with their hands in the soil. The snow had melted weeks ago and the ground had dried enough to be worked, and the village had emerged from its winter hibernation with a collective energy that was almost visible, a quickening of movement and purpose that spread from household to household like a contagion of activity. Aldric sat on the stone at the edge of the yard and watched it all happen around him, a spectator at a performance in which he had once played a leading role but was now only a member of the audience, seated far from the stage and barely acknowledged by the other players. The stone had become his place during the days, a flat, grey rock that jutted from the packed earth near the door and caught the morning sun, if the morning sun was available. It was not comfortable in any conventional sense, but it had the advantage of being outside, of offering a view of the yard and the lane and the distant field, and the act of sitting on it required no explanation or justification because sitting on stones was simply what old men did when there was nothing else for them to do. He had watched the village come back to life from this stone over the course of several weeks, had seen the tools brought out from storage and cleaned and sharpened, had seen the animals turned out from the byre to graze on the first thin grass of the season, had seen the children released from the confinement of the cottages to run and shout and chase each other through the muddy lanes. All of it was familiar and all of it was distant. A play that he had seen performed many times, but in which his own lines had been cut and his own movements erased from the blocking. The plough was back in the field now, and Edric was behind it, and the oxen were leaning into their yoke with the patient determination of animals who understood their purpose in the world, even if they could not articulate it. The field was being prepared for the barley that would be sown as soon as the furrows were ready, and Aldric watched the work with eyes that saw more than the simple turning of the soil. He saw the way Edric was guiding the plough too close to the lower edge of the field, where the ground dipped and held water after every rain. And he knew that the seeds sown there would rot in the wet soil and produce nothing but disappointment when the harvest came. He saw the angle of the new drainage ditch that Edric and 2 other men had dug the previous week, a ditch that was meant to carry the spring runoff away from the planted ground and down toward the stream. And he saw that the angle was wrong by perhaps 2 degrees, just enough that the water would not flow as freely as it should, and would instead pool and stagnate and create a breeding ground for the insects that damaged the young plants. The knowledge was there in his mind, whole and complete and perfectly clear, and it has been placed there by decades of watching and doing and learning the particular character of this particular piece of land. He knew the lower field because he had planted it himself more times than he could count, had learned through trial and error and the patient observation of results exactly where the ground was too wet for barley and where it was just right, where the slope was sufficient for drainage and where it needed help, where the soil was rich and dark and where it was thin and pale and exhausted. The knowledge had been earned through years of labor and attention, and the slow accumulation of small lessons that had been written not in books, but in the memory of his hands and the back of his mind, and now it sat there unused and unrequested, a storehouse of wisdom that no one came to visit. He said nothing. The words formed in his mind and sat there for a moment and then dissolved without ever reaching his tongue, because he had learned through the quiet lessons of the past year that words spoken by an old man from a stone at the edge of the yard were words that carried no weight, were sounds that drifted away on the spring breeze and were lost among the more urgent sounds of work and purpose. Edric would listen if Aldric spoke, would pause and incline his head and perhaps even nod in acknowledgments. But the words would not change the angle of the plough or the path of the ditch, because the world had moved on and the decisions now belonged to younger hands and younger minds that had their own ways of doing things and their own lessons to learn. The wisdom of the old was a currency that had been devalued by time and circumstance, and no amount of correctness could restore its purchasing power. A robin landed on the edge of the stone wall that separated the yard from the lane. A small bird with a red breast and a quick, nervous manner, and it cocked its head and regarded Aldric with one bright eye, before dropping to the ground and pulling a worm from the damp soil. The worm stretched and resisted, and then came free with a soft popping sound, and the robin flew away with its prize and left Aldric alone again with his thoughts and his knowledge, and the distant sound of the plough turning the earth in the wrong place. He watched the bird disappear into the alder trees and thought about the seasons of 40 years past, seasons that had been filled with the same sounds and the same sights and the same slow turning of the agricultural wheel, and the only difference between then and now was that then he had been part of the turning, and now as if he had been part of the turning, and now he was only watching it happen. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows shortened, and the warmth of the day began to penetrate even the cold stone on which he sat. He shifted his weight slightly and felt the familiar ache in his back respond to the movement, a small reminder that his body was still present and still capable of registering discomfort, even when his mind was occupied with other things. The robin had returned, or perhaps it was a different robin, and it hopped along the base of the wall and probed the soil with its beak and found nothing worth extracting, and then it flew away again, and the yard was still except for the slow drift of dust motes in the sunlight and the distant sound of voices from the field. The morning passed into afternoon without any discernible boundary, a smooth transition that was marked only by the changing position of the sun and the lengthening of the shadows on the eastern side of the cottage. Aldric remained on the stone because there was nowhere else that required his presence, and nothing else that required his attention, and the stone had become a kind of home within the larger home of the yard, a defined space that belonged to him by virtue of his occupation of it. He had brought out a piece of bread earlier, a hard heel that had been left from the morning meal, and he chewed it slowly and felt the rough texture of the crust against his gums and the roof of his mouth, and the act of chewing was something to do that filled the time and gave a small purpose to the movement of his jaw. The planting would begin soon, perhaps tomorrow or the day after, once the furrows had been completed and the soil had been harrowed and smoothed and made ready to receive the seed. He could see the banks of seed barley stacked near the shed, rough sacks made of coarse fabric that bulged with the weight of the grain they contained, and he knew exactly how much seed was in each sack and how much ground it would cover, and what the yield would be if the weather was favorable, and the pests were few and the drainage was adequate. The drainage would not be adequate because the ditch was wrong, and the yield from the lower field would be less than it should be, and this knowledge sat in his chest like a small stone that he could not swallow and could not spit out. It was not a heavy stone, and it did not cause him pain in any physical sense, but it was there and he was aware of it. And he would continue to be aware of it through the summer and into the harvest, when the proof of his unspoken knowledge would be visible in the thin and stunted stalks of barley that struggled up from the waterlogged soil. The afternoon wore on, and the light began to take on the golden quality that came in the hours before evening, and the sounds from the field changed as the work wound down, and the men began to gather their tools and make their way back toward the village. Edric came through the gate and into the yard, his face flushed with the exertion of the day, and his tunic dark with sweat, and he walked to the well and drew up a bucket of water and drank deeply, and then poured the remainder over his head and shoulders, shaking the water from his hair like a dog emerging from a stream. He did not look at Aldric as he did this, or if he did look, it was only a glance that registered the old man's presence without engaging with it, the way one notes the location of a familiar piece of furniture while walking through a room. Aldric watched his son and thought about the words he could say, the words that were still there in his mind, and would remain there until he released them, or until he died, and they died with him. He could tell Edric about the lower field and the drainage ditch, and the angle that was wrong by 2 degrees, could explain in patient detail the way the water would pool and the seeds would rot and the harvest would suffer, could offer the accumulated wisdom of 40 seasons of planting and tending and reaping. The words were lined up and ready, a small army of sentences that had been drilled and prepared for deployment, but he kept them in reserve because he understood with a clarity that required no explanation that they would not be received in the way they were offered. Edric would listen and nod and perhaps even thank him, and then Edric would go inside and eat his evening meal and sleep his deep and dreamless sleep, and wake in the morning and plant the barley exactly as he had planned to plant it, because the knowledge of the young is always more convincing than the knowledge of the old, even when it is wrong. The evening meal was the same as it always was, a thick porridge with a few pieces of dried fish that had been soaked and softened, and Aldric ate his portion from his clay bowl and listened to the voices of the family as they discussed the day's work and the plans for tomorrow and the small concerns of a household that was busy and productive and full of purpose. The children talked about the birds they had seen and the games they had played, and Edric talked about the field and the seed and the hope for a good harvest, and his wife talked about the supplies that were running low and the things that would need to be obtained from the market in the next village. No one asked Aldric anything, and no one expected him to contribute, and this absence of expectation was not unkind, but was simply the natural order of things, the way that water flows downhill and the sun rises in the east, and the old become silent while the young become loud. He lay on his pallet that night and listened to the sounds of the cottage settling and the distant call of an owl and the soft breathing of the others, and he thought about the lower field and the drainage ditch and the robin that had pulled the worm from the damp soil. The robin had known exactly where to probe, because robins carry within them a knowledge of the earth and the things that live in it, a knowledge that is not taught but is simply present, a gift of instinct and experience, and the slow accumulation of successful hunts and failed attempts. He had that same knowledge about the land and the water and the way they interacted, but his knowledge was locked inside him and would remain there because the world had decided, without deciding, that the wisdom of the old was no longer worth seeking. The days that followed were a repetition of the same pattern, a pattern that was as old as agriculture and as predictable as the phases of the moon. The planting began, and Aldric watched it from his stone, saw the seed being scattered across the prepared soil in the broad and sweeping gestures that he himself had made thousands of times, saw the harrow being dragged over the planted ground to cover the seed and protect it from the birds, saw the slow transformation of the field from bare earth to a surface that held a hidden promise beneath its dark and patient face. The work was done well enough, or at least it was done with the care and attention that Edric brought to all his tasks, but Aldric could see the places where it was not quite right, and he kept these observations to himself and let them accumulate in his mind, like the dust that accumulated in his mind, like the dust that accumulated on the unused fishing net. The weather held and the seeds germinated, and the first pale green shoots appeared in the field, thin and fragile and full of the potential that would either be realized or lost, depending on the drainage and the rain, and the thousand other factors that determine the difference between a good harvest and a poor one. Aldric watched the shoots emerge and grow, and he could see already the difference between the upper field where the drainage was adequate and the lower field where the water would pool and the plants would struggle, and the difference was small at first but would grow larger as the season progressed. A visible demonstration of the knowledge that he had kept to himself. He did not feel vindicated by this, because vindication required an audience, and he had none. And he did not feel bitter, because bitterness required an expectation that had been disappointed, and he had long since stopped expecting anything at all. He simply observed the slow unfolding of consequences, and noted the accuracy of his own predictions, and returned his attention to the stone and the sun, and the small movements of birds and insects in the yard. The wisdom was still there, and it was still unused, and it would remain so until the end. A quiet companion that asked nothing of him and offered nothing in return except the cold comfort of being right in a world that had stopped asking for his opinion. The meals came at regular intervals throughout the day, a rhythm that was as old and as reliable as the rising of the sun or the turning of the tides, and Aldric had learned to measure the passage of time by the small variations in what was placed before him. The morning porridge was the first meal, served shortly after the fire had been stirred back to life, and the chill of the night had been pushed back to the corners of the room, and it was always the same in its essential character, even as the details shifted according to the season and the supplies and the quiet calculations of his daughter-in-law. The porridge was made from barley meal that had been ground at the Lord's mill and brought home in rough sacks that leaked a fine dust of flour along the path, and it was cooked in the iron pot with water and a small pinch of salt that had been obtained from the travelling merchant who came through the village twice each year. The resulting substance was neither thick nor thin, but occupied a middle ground that was determined by the ratio of meal to water, and this ratio was not fixed, but varied according to factors that Aldric had learned to read over the course of the long winter. He had noticed, in the quiet and patient way that one notices things when there is nothing else to occupy the attention, that his portion of the morning porridge had grown slightly thinner in recent weeks. The change was not dramatic and would not have been apparent to anyone who was not paying very close attention to the precise consistency of the greyish substance in the bottom of a clay bowl, but Aldric paid very close attention because the porridge was one of the few things left in his life that varied in any measurable way. The porridge in his bowl was now more water than meal, a fact that revealed itself in the way the surface shimmered slightly in the firelight and in the way the spoon moved through it with less resistance than it once had. The taste was the same, or nearly the same, though the flavour of the barley was fainter and the salt was less detectable, and the warmth of it was the same warmth that spread through his chest and settled in his stomach and provided a small comfort against the persistent chill of the morning. He did not mention the thinness of the porridge to anyone, because there was no one to mention it to who could change it, and because mentioning it would have required acknowledging a truth that everyone in the cottage already knew, but no one spoke aloud. The truth was that the stores of barley meal were finite and must last until the next harvest, and the truth was that the strong arms that worked the fields required more fuel than the old bones that sat by the fire, and the truth was that the children who were growing and changing with each passing month needed the nourishment that would carry them into adulthood and the work that adulthood demanded. Aldric understood these truths as well as anyone, and better than most, because he had once been the one making the calculations, had once stood by the pot with the ladle in his hand and made the same small decisions about who would receive the thicker portion and who would make do with the thinner. The calculations were not cruel, and were not even conscious in any deliberate sense, but were simply the arithmetic of survival that every household performed without comment or complaint. The midday meal was a more variable affair, depending on what was available and what work was being done, and whether anyone had the time or the inclination to prepare anything more than a piece of bread and a cup of water. During the busy seasons of planting and harvest, the midday meal was often taken in the field, a quick pause in the labour that was measured in minutes rather than hours, and the food was whatever could be carried in a cloth and eaten with one hand, while the other hand rested on a plough handle or a sickle. During the slower seasons, and for those who no longer participated in the labor, the midday meal was taken inside near the hearth and consisted of whatever had been left from the morning or whatever could be assembled from the limited stores without drawing too heavily on the supplies that must last. For Aldric, the midday meal was almost always a piece of bread, and the bread was almost always stale. The bread was baked once a week in the communal oven that stood at the edge of the village, a large dome of clay and stone that was fired with wood and used by all the households in turn, and the loaves that emerged from that oven were round and flat and dense, with the weight of the whole barley meal from which they were made. The bread was good on the day it was baked, warm and fragrant and slightly soft in the center, but it hardened quickly as the days passed, and by the end of the week it was a substance that required serious effort to consume. Aldric's portion of the bread was always a heel, the end piece that was harder and crustier than the center slices and contained less of the soft interior that the children preferred, and he accepted this without thought because the heel was what was left after the others had taken their shares and there was no point in wishing for something different. He would hold the bread in his hands and feel its weight and its texture, the rough surface that scraped against his palms and the dense solidity that promised a long and patient process of consumption. The first bite was always the most difficult, because the crust resisted his teeth in a way that the softer bread of his younger years had never done, and he would work at it slowly and methodically, breaking off small pieces and letting them soften in his mouth before attempting to chew. The bread had a taste that was familiar and comforting in its familiarity, a nutty and earthy flavor that spoke of the field and the grain and the long chain of labor that had transformed the seed into the loaf, and he would let each piece sit on his tongue for a moment before swallowing, drawing out the experience because there was nothing else to do and no reason to hurry. The water that accompanied the bread was drawn from the well and carried to the cottage in a clay jug that sweated with condensation in the summer and grew a thin skin of ice in the winter, and it had a taste that was particular to this place and this well, and the deep aquifer that fed it. The water was cold and clean, and asked nothing of him except to be drunk, and he would take small sips between bites of the bread and feel the cold liquid travel down his throat and settle in his stomach alongside the dense mass of the soaked grain. The combination of bread and water was the foundation of his diet now, the base upon which the occasional additions of porridge and broth and the rare piece of dried fish or meat were layered, and it was enough to keep him alive and no more than enough. The evening meal was the main meal of the day, served after the work was done and the animals were settled and the family gathered around the hearth in the shrinking circle of light and warmth. The evening meal was always some variation of pottage, a thick soup or thin stew made from whatever was available and cooked slowly in the iron pot over the course of the afternoon, filling the cottage with smells that promised sustenance and comfort. The base of the pottage was always barley, the same barley that went into the porridge and the bread, but it was supplemented with whatever else could be found, with beans and peas and the tough greens that grew wild at the edges of the fields, with onions and leeks from the small garden behind the cottage, with the occasional piece of salted fish or dried meat that added a depth of flavor and the suggestion of richness that was more memory than reality. Aldric watched the ladle as it descended into the pot and emerged with his portion, and he had learned to read the contents of the ladle with a precision that was almost scientific. The ladle would dip into the pot and emerge with a quantity of liquid that varied according to the level of the pot and the angle of the ladle and the unconscious calculations of the hand that held it, and within that liquid there would be a certain number of solid pieces, beans and greens, and the small fragments of barley that had not dissolved into the broth. He had noticed, in the same quiet and patient way that he noticed the thinness of the porridge, that the number of solid pieces in his portion had decreased over the course of the winter and the spring. The broth was still warm and still carried the flavor of the ingredients that had been cooked in it, but the substance of the meal was thinner, and the spoon encountered less resistance as it moved through the liquid, and the feeling of fullness that followed the meal was less complete than it had once been. The arithmetic of the ladle was simple and brutal and entirely unspoken. The pot held a finite amount of food, and the family held a certain number of mouths, and the food must be distributed in a way that ensured the survival of the household through the lean months until the next harvest. The strongest workers received the most because their labor was essential to the production of future food, and the growing children received the next most because they represented the future of the household and the continuation of the line, and the old man who sat by the fire and contributed nothing, received whatever was left. The calculation was not made with malice or even with conscious awareness, but was simply the way of things, the same way that a wolf pack feeds the hunters before the old and the weak, the same way that a tree directs its resources to the growing branches and lets the old leaves fall. Aldric understood this arithmetic because he had been on the other side of it for most of his life, had been the one whose bowl was filled first and whose portion was the largest because his strength was needed for the ploughing and the planting and the harvest. He had accepted the larger portions without guilt because they were necessary, and because he had earned them through the labor of his body, and he accepted the smaller portions now with the same quiet resignation because they were also necessary and because he had earned them through the simple fact of having survived long enough to become a burden. The symmetry of the arrangement was not lost on him, but it brought no comfort and no bitterness, only a tired recognition of the way the world worked. The sound of the wooden spoons scraping against the bottom of the clay bowl was a sound that had come to mark the end of each meal, and he had learned to listen for it with a particular attention. The spoon would move through the liquid and encounter the rough surface of the bowl, and the sound would change from a soft swish to a harder scrape. And this transition signaled that the meal was over, and there would be no more until the next appointed time. The scraping sound was always the same, regardless of how much or how little had been in the bowl, but he had noticed that it came sooner now than it once had, that the distance between the first bite and the final scrape had shortened by a small but measurable amount. The hunger that remained after the meal was a quiet companion, not sharp or urgent, but persistent and low, a background presence that colored the long hours between meals and reminded him constantly of his position in the household and the world. The hunger was not the only reminder of his dependency, but it was the most constant and the most physical. There were other reminders, smaller and less tangible but no less real, that accumulated over the course of the days and weeks and formed a picture of his place that was impossible to ignore. The blanket on his pallet was thinner than the blankets on the other pallets, not because anyone had decided to give him the worst blanket, but because the best blankets went to the children and the workers, and the old man received what was left. The space he occupied near the hearth was the space that was least convenient for the work of the household, the corner where the draught was strongest and the warmth was weakest, and the stool could be placed without interfering with the movement of those who had tasks to perform. The words that were spoken in his presence were fewer and less directed at him than the words that were spoken among the others, not because anyone was deliberately excluding him, but because he had ceased to be a part of the active life of the household and had become instead a part of the background, a fixture that was present but not relevant. He watched the children eat their portions with the quick and thoughtless hunger of the young, spooning the pottage into their mouths and reaching for more bread and drinking their water in great gulps. And he remembered being that age and eating with the same unconsidered urgency, taking for granted that the food would be there and the bowl would be filled and the hunger would be satisfied. The memory was pleasant, but distant and carried with it no regret, only a faint wonder at the person he had once been, a person who had eaten without counting the beans in the broth and had slept without listening to the sounds of his own body slowly failing. The days passed, and the meals continued their steady rhythm, and the level of the barley sack in the corner fell by small and imperceptible increments. The sack had been full at the start of the winter, a heavy and reassuring presence that promised survival through the cold months, and now it was less than half full and growing lighter with each passing week. The spring planting had been completed, and the new crop was growing in the field, but it would be many months before the harvest and the threshing and the grinding, and the arithmetic of the intervening time was written in the diminishing bulk of that sack. Aldric could see the sack from his stool, and he could track its decline with the same patient attention that he gave to the light on the wall and the consistency of his porridge, and he understood that the thinness of his portions was directly connected to the shrinking of the sack and the need to stretch its contents across the hungry gap between the old harvest and the new. The hungry gap was a term that everyone knew, but no one spoke, a period in the late spring and early summer when the stores from the previous harvest were running low and the new crop was not yet ready to be eaten. It was a time of careful rationing and quiet anxiety, of watching the sky for signs of weather that might delay the ripening of the grain, of measuring each handful of meal with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Aldric had lived through more hungry gaps than he could count, and he knew their rhythms and their dangers, knew that a late frost or a dry spell or a plague of insects could stretch the gap beyond the capacity of the stores to bridge. The current gap was not the worst he had known, but it was also not the best, and the thinness of his porridge and the scarcity of beans in his pottage were the small and personal manifestations of a larger calculus that encompassed the whole village and the whole region and the whole precarious system of medieval subsistence. He chewed his stale bread and drank his cold water, and listened to the sounds of the household going about its business, and he felt the hunger that was always there now, a quiet and patient companion that had moved into his body and made itself at home. The hunger was not a crisis and would not become one as long as the portions continued and the sack held out and the new crop came in on time, but it was a constant reminder of his position at the bottom of the household's priorities, a position that was not chosen and not resented, but simply occupied, like the stool by the fire and the stone in the yard and the narrow space on the pallet in the corner. The evening meal came and went, and the scraping of the spoon against the bowl marked the end of another day, and Aldric lay on his pallet and listened to his stomach make the small and private sounds of incomplete satisfaction. The sounds were not loud enough for anyone else to hear, and they would fade as the night wore on and the body turned its attention to other things, but for now they were there, and he listened to them and thought about the bread that would come at midday tomorrow, and the porridge that would come in the morning, and the long and patient arithmetic of survival that governed every aspect of his existence. The thoughts were not unhappy and were not happy, but were simply there, a part of the night and the darkness and the slow drift towards sleep that would carry him through the hours until the grey light returned and the fire was stirred and the porridge pot was placed over the flames once more. The morning was warm for the first time in many months, a warmth that carried with it the smell of damp earth and new grass and the faint sweetness of the first wildflowers opening in the hedgerows, and Aldric sat on his stone and felt the sun on his face and thought about nothing in particular, until the sound of voices in the lane drew his attention away from the warmth and toward the small procession that was making its way past the gate. The voices were not the usual voices of the village, not the low and familiar murmur of neighbors discussing the weather or the crops or the small concerns of daily life, but were instead a mix of tones and accents that suggested strangers and officials, and the kind of business that came from outside the narrow boundaries of the village and brought with it the weight of the wider world. He rose from the stone, slowly and with the familiar protest of his knees and his back, and walked to the gate and stood there with one hand resting on the rough wood of the top rail, and he watched the people moving along the lane toward the village green. There were several men from the village, farmers whose faces he knew and whose names he could recall if he took a moment to search for them, and there were two men he did not recognize, men who wore better clothing than anyone in the village owned and carried with them the unmistakable air of authority. One of the strangers was a young man with a smooth face and a leather satchel slung across his chest, and he walked with the careful attention of someone who was not accustomed to the uneven surface of a village lane, picking his way around the mud and the stones and the other obstacles that the villagers navigated without thought. The other stranger was older and heavier, and wore a dark tunic that was trimmed with a thin line of something that might have been fur, or might have been only a different color of wool, and he carried no satchel but instead held a rolled parchment in one hand and used the other to gesture at the fields and the hedgerows as he spoke. Aldric knew what they were without being told, knew it from the satchel and the parchment and the particular quality of self-importance that clung to the strangers, like the smell of wood smoke clung to the villagers. The young man with the satchel was a clerk, a scribe who wrote things down and made them official and permanent in a way that spoken words could never be, and the older man was some kind of steward or bailiff or representative of the manor court, a person whose job was to settle disputes and collect dues and ensure that the complex machinery of feudal obligation continued to turn. They had come to the village for some purpose that was important enough to draw them out from the manor house or the market town, and the purpose had gathered the villagers together on the green, where such matters were always discussed and decided. He followed the procession at a distance, walking slowly and carefully, and feeling the uneven ground through the thin soles of his shoes, and by the time he reached the edge of the green, a small crowd had already gathered in a loose semicircle around the strangers. The green was a patch of common land at the center of the village, a rough expanse of grass that was kept short by the grazing of geese and sheep and the constant passage of feet, and it was here that the village held its markets and its festivals and its occasional encounters with the authority of the outside world. A large stone stood at one end of the green, a grey and weathered boulder that had been there for longer than anyone could remember, and served as a seat for the old men, and a climbing place for the children, and a marker of something that no one could quite recall. The clerk had settled himself on a smaller stone near the large one, and had opened his satchel and removed a sheet of parchment and a small clay pot of ink and a quill that he was trimming with a small knife, his movements precise and unhurried and full of the importance of his task. The older man, the steward or bailiff or whatever he was, stood in the center of the semicircle and addressed the gathered villagers in a voice that was loud and clear and accustomed to being heard and obeyed. The voice spoke of boundaries and rights and the proper division of land, of a dispute that had arisen between two neighboring farms over the exact location of the line that separated their fields, of the need to establish the truth of the matter and record it in writing so that there would be no further confusion or conflict. Aldric listened to the voice and felt a small stirring in his chest, a recognition that was not quite memory, but was something adjacent to memory, a sense that the words being spoken were connected to something he knew or had once known. The dispute was between two farms that lay at the northern edge of the village lands, farms that bordered the common pasture and the small stream that ran down from the wood, and the question was where the old boundary stone had been placed, the stone that had marked the division between the two holdings for as long as anyone could remember. The stone had been moved or buried or lost during the Great Flood of '82, the flood that had swept through the valley and changed the course of the stream and left behind a landscape that was subtly but permanently altered. And the two farmers had been arguing about the boundary ever since, each claiming that the stone had been on his side of the new line and that the other was encroaching on land that was not his. The steward asked questions and the farmers answered them, their voices rising and falling with the passion of men who believed themselves to be right and the other to be wrong, and the clerk wrote everything down with quick and careful strokes of his quill, the nib scratching across the parchment with a sound that was dry and persistent and somehow final. Aldric watched the clerk's hand move and listened to the scratching of the quill and the voices of the farmers, and the stirring in his chest grew stronger and more defined, resolving into a clear and certain knowledge that surprised him with its completeness. He knew where the stone was. He knew because he had been there when it was placed, had been a young man of perhaps 20 years, and had helped to dig the hole and set the stone and pack the earth around its base, had watched his own father and the fathers of the men who were now arguing pour a libation of ale over the stone to mark the occasion and make it sacred and binding. The memory was not a vague impression, but a sharp and detailed picture that had been stored in his mind for more than 40 years and was now emerging into the light with perfect clarity. He could see the exact spot where the stone had been placed, a slight rise in the ground just above the old course of the stream, a place where a large oak tree had once stood and had since been cut down and removed. The oak was gone now, and the stream had moved, and the landscape had changed. But the spot itself was still there beneath the grass and the soil, and he could have walked to it with his eyes closed and placed his hand on the exact location where the stone had rested before the flood had shifted it and buried it and hidden it from everyone except those who had been there to see it placed. He stood at the back of the crowd and said nothing, because speaking up would have required pushing through the gathered villagers and inserting himself into a proceeding that was already well underway, and because the habit of silence had grown so strong over the past year that breaking it felt like an impossible effort. He waited instead and listened to the farmers argue and the steward mediate and the clerk scratch his endless record onto the parchment, and he watched the faces of the other villagers who had gathered to witness the dispute and offer their own memories and opinions. Some of them were old like him, old enough to remember the flood and the years before it, and he saw in their faces the same flicker of recognition that he felt in his own chest, the same knowledge of where the stone had been and where it should be now. None of them spoke either, or if they did, their voices were too soft to carry over the louder voices of the farmers and the steward, and their words were lost in the general murmur of the crowd. The sun climbed higher and the warmth of the day increased, and the voices continued their back and forth, and Aldric felt his legs grow tired from standing and wished for his stone at the edge of the yard, but remained where he was because the matter was not yet settled, and the knowledge in his chest would not let him leave. The clerk had filled one side of the parchment and was turning it over to begin the other side, and the steward was growing impatient with the lack of clear evidence and was beginning to speak in the tone of a man who would soon make a decision based on convenience rather than truth. The younger farmer, the one whose voice was louder and whose manner was more confident, was winning the argument not because he was right, but because he was persistent and because his version of the boundary was the one that required the least effort to accept. The steward raised his hand for silence, and the crowd grew quiet, and the clerk held his quill ready above the parchment, and the steward began to speak the words that would become the official record of the boundary, the words that would be written down and carried back to the manor and preserved for all future disputes and disagreements. The boundary would run from the large stone on the green, the stone that everyone could see and agree upon, and then it would follow a straight line toward the old oak, the oak that was no longer there, and from there it would continue to the stream as it now ran, the stream that had moved and would move again, and the line that the steward described was a line that had been drawn not by memory or by truth, but by the louder voice and the simpler story. Aldric heard the words and felt the knowledge in his chest press against his ribs and demand to be released, and he opened his mouth and spoke, or tried to speak. But the voice that came out was thin and raspy and was immediately caught by a gust of wind that swept across the green and carried the sound away before it could reach the ears of anyone who mattered. He tried again, and the same thing happened, the words forming in his throat and emerging as a faint whisper that was swallowed by the wind and the distance and the general inattention of the crowd. The steward did not look at him, and the clerk did not pause in his writing, and the farmers continued to nod and agree with the words that were being spoken, and Aldric stood at the back of the crowd with his mouth open and his knowledge trapped inside him, and felt the weight of his uselessness settle over him like a second cloak. One of the other old men, a neighbor named Oswin, who was perhaps 5 years younger than Aldric and still had enough strength in his voice to be heard, stepped forward and tried to speak, tried to tell the steward about the old boundary and the stone and the true location that everyone of a certain age remembered. The steward listened for a moment and then raised his hand again and explained in patient and condescending tones that the court required evidence that could be verified, that memories were fallible and varied from person to person, that the written record must be based on facts that could be seen and measured and agreed upon by all parties. The words were reasonable and calm and completely dismissive of everything that Oswin had tried to say, and the old man stepped back into the crowd with his shoulders slumped and his face empty of expression. The clerk finished writing and sprinkled sand over the wet ink to dry it, and then rolled the parchment carefully and placed it in his satchel, and the matter was settled. The boundary was recorded and would be observed, and the louder farmer had won, and the quieter farmer had lost, and the truth of where the stone actually lay beneath the grass, and the soil was a truth that would remain buried, along with the stone itself. The crowd began to disperse, the villagers returning to their work and their homes and their small concerns, and the strangers gathered their things and prepared to continue their journey to the next village, or the next dispute, or the next piece of parchment that required filling. Aldric remained at the edge of the green for a long time after everyone else had gone, standing alone in the warm sun and looking at the large stone that everyone agreed upon and thinking about the other stone that everyone had forgotten. The large stone was grey and weathered and covered with patches of pale lichen, and it had been there for so long that no one remembered who had placed it or why, and its only value now was as a reference point from which to measure the boundaries that mattered to the living. The other stone, the boundary stone that he had helped to place, was buried somewhere beneath the grass of the northern field, hidden and forgotten and useless. And the truth of its location existed only in the minds of a few old people whose memories were considered unreliable, and whose voices were too weak to carry over the wind. He turned and began the slow walk back to the cottage, his legs heavy and his feet finding the familiar path without the need for conscious direction. The lane was empty now, and the village was quiet, the brief excitement of the official visit having faded back into the ordinary rhythms of the day, and he walked past the alder trees and the stone wall and the gate to the field where the young barley was growing in neat green rows. The barley did not care about boundaries or stones or the memories of old men, and it would continue to grow and ripen and be harvested regardless of who claimed ownership of the soil in which it was rooted. The thought was not comforting, but it was true, and he held on to it as he walked, a small and solid fact in a world that seemed to have less and less use for the facts that he carried within him. The cottage was quiet when he arrived, his daughter-in-law working in the garden behind the house and the children playing somewhere out of sight, and he lowered himself onto his stool by the cold hearth and sat in the dim light and listened to the silence. The fire had not been lit because the day was warm and the work of the household did not require it, and the absence of the flames left a hole in the room that was more than just visual, a missing center around which the rest of the space seemed to have lost its orientation. He sat in the cool dimness and thought about the stone and the flood, and the young man he had been. The young man who had dug the hole and set the stone and watched his father pour ale over it and pronounce the words that made it binding. That young man had believed that the stone would stand forever, that the boundary it marked would be respected by generations yet unborn, that the small ceremony of placement and libation had fixed something in the world that could not be unfixed. The flood had come, and the stone had shifted, and the young man had grown old, and now the boundary was whatever the clerk wrote on his parchment, and the truth was whatever the louder voice declared it to be. The sound of the quill scratching across the parchment came back to him as he sat there, a dry and persistent sound that had seemed to erase even as it recorded, writing over the truth with a version that was more convenient and more easily verified. The scratch of the quill was the sound of the world moving on, of the young and the strong and the literate deciding what would be remembered and what would be forgotten, and his own voice had been no match for it, had been a thin and raspy whisper that was lost in the wind before it could reach any ear that mattered. He had known the truth and had been unable to speak it, and even if he had spoken it, he would not have been believed, because the truth of an old man was not the kind of truth that the clerk could write down, and the steward could enforce, and the court could preserve. The afternoon passed in the same slow and undifferentiated way that all afternoons passed, and the light through the small window shifted and softened, and began to take on the golden quality of evening. His daughter-in-law came in from the garden and stirred the fire back to life and began to prepare the evening meal, and the familiar sounds and smells of the household filled the room and pushed the silence back into the corners. Edric came in from the field and washed his hands and face and sat down to eat, and the children gathered around, and the bowls were filled, and the meal was consumed in the usual way, with the usual sounds and the usual portions, and the usual absence of any acknowledgement of the old man in the corner. Aldric ate his thin pottage and listened to the family talk about the strangers and the dispute and the boundary, and he heard Edric repeat the version that the steward had declared, the version that was now official and would be remembered and passed on. The stone was lost, and the boundary was drawn from the green to the missing oak to the present stream, and this was the truth now, because it had been written down, and because the louder farmer had won, and because no one had spoken up to say otherwise with a voice that could be heard. He listened and said nothing, and finished his pottage, and set his bowl aside, and sat in the corner while the evening settled over the cottage, and the family prepared for sleep. The knowledge of the true boundary was still there in his mind, whole and complete, and perfectly clear, and it would remain there until he died, and it died with him. The stone would remain buried beneath the grass and the soil, and the farmers would argue again in another generation when the stream shifted once more and the parchment was lost or destroyed or simply forgotten, and no one would know where the true boundary lay because everyone who had known was dead, and their memories had died with them. The thought was not sad and was not happy, but was simply the way of things, the way that water wore away, stone and time wore away, memory and the world moved on without carrying forward everything that had once been known and true. He lay on his pallet in the darkness, and listened to the breathing of the others, and the rustle of the thatch in the evening breeze, and he thought about the scribe's ink, and the scratch of the quill, and the way that a few marks on a piece of parchment could overwrite 40 years of memory and truth. The ink was dry now, and the parchment was rolled and stored in the leather satchel, and tomorrow it would be carried away to the manor house or the market town, and placed in a chest with other parchments and other records, and it would outlast him and outlast everyone who knew the truth. And in the end, the only boundary that would matter was the boundary that had been written down. The stone would remain where it was, buried and silent and forgotten, and the old man who remembered it would join it soon enough, and the world would continue on without either of them, drawing its lines and writing its records, and forgetting the things that could not be verified and measured and agreed upon by the loudest voices in the crowd. The summer arrived with a weight that was different from the weight of winter, a heavy and pressing presence that settled over the village and the fields and the cottage and refused to lift even in the hours after sunset, when the sky darkened and the stars emerged and the world was supposed to cool and rest. The heat was not the sharp and immediate heat of a fire, but was instead a diffuse and all-encompassing warmth that seemed to come from every direction at once, from the sun that hung in the pale sky like a white coin, from the ground that radiated back the warmth it had absorbed over the long hours of daylight, from the walls of the cottage that held the heat and released it slowly through the night, so that there was no escape and no relief, and no moment when the air felt truly cool against the skin. Aldric had lived through more summers than he could count, and he knew their rhythms and their demands, but this summer felt different in a way that was difficult to name. Heavier and slower and more oppressive, as if the season itself had grown tired and was moving through its appointed days with the same weary reluctance that he felt in his own bones. The stool by the hearth had become unbearable during the daylight hours because the hearth retained the heat of the morning fire long after the flames had been extinguished, and the air in that corner of the room was thick and still and seemed to resist being drawn into the lungs. He had moved his sitting place to the outdoors, to a spot at the edge of the small garden behind the cottage, where a single elder tree grew and cast a patch of shade that shifted and shrank and expanded again as the sun moved across the sky. The elder was an old tree, older than Aldric and older than anyone in the village, its trunk gnarled and twisted and covered with a rough bark that flaked away in small grey pieces, and its branches spread outward in a wide and generous canopy that filtered the sunlight and reduced it to a dappled pattern of light and shadow that moved and danced on the ground beneath. He had claimed this spot as his own in the same quiet and unspoken way that he had claimed the stone by the gate and the stool by the hearth, and no one contested his occupation of it, because the spot served no other purpose, and because the old man sitting in the shade of the elder tree had become as much a part of the summer landscape as the tree itself. The task that had been assigned to him, if it could be called a task, was to scare away the crows that came to investigate the garden, and the young vegetables that were growing there in neat rows. The crows were clever birds with glossy black feathers and sharp eyes that missed nothing, and they knew as well as anyone that the old man under the elder tree was no threat to them. They would land on the edge of the garden and hop forward with quick and jerky movements, and cock their heads to examine the tender shoots of the peas and the beans. And they would watch Aldric with one bright eye, and wait to see if he would rise or shout or wave his arms. He rarely did any of these things because the effort of rising was greater than the value of the vegetables the crows might take, and because the heat made every movement feel like wading through deep water, and because the crows would only fly up to the branches of the elder and wait there until he settled again before returning to their careful examination of the garden. The crows had learned this pattern and had incorporated it into their own rhythms, and the result was a kind of truce that benefited no one but disturbed no one either. Aldric would sit with his back against the trunk of the elder and his hands resting on his thighs and his eyes half closed against the brightness, and the crows would hop among the vegetables and peck at the soil and occasionally pull up a small plant and discard it. And neither party acknowledged the other except in the most peripheral way. The crows made sounds that were harsh and guttural and somehow suited to the heat. Short and repetitive calls that seemed to be conversations about nothing in particular, and Aldric listened to them and let the sounds wash over him and blend with the other sounds wash over him and blend with the other sounds of the summer afternoon. The other sounds were many and varied, and together they formed a tapestry of noise that was so constant and so familiar that he only noticed it when he made a deliberate effort to do so. The sound that dominated all the others was the sound of the scythes in the hay meadow, a sound that carried across the fields and through the hedgerows and reached him beneath the elder tree as a rhythmic and distant whisper. The hay harvest was the great work of early summer, the cutting and drying and gathering of the grass that would feed the animals through the winter months, and every able-bodied person in the village was engaged in it from dawn until dusk. The scythes moved through the tall grass with a sound that was part swish and part hiss, a long and sweeping note that was followed by a brief pause and then repeated over and over all day long, until the sound became less a sound and more a texture of the air itself, a constant and unchanging presence that was felt as much as heard. He could picture the hay meadow without needing to see it, could see the line of men and women moving across the field with their scythes and their rakes, the bright blades flashing in the sun and the cut grass falling in long and even swaths behind them. The smell of the cut grass reached him even at this distance, a sweet and green and slightly sharp smell that was the defining smell of summer, and it mingled with the other smells of the season, the warm and dusty smell of the dry earth, and the faint and delicate smell of the elder flowers that hung in white clusters from the branches above his head, and the occasional drift of wood smoke from some distant fire that someone had lit for reasons he could not guess. The flies were a constant presence in the shade of the elder, small black flies that buzzed and circled and landed on his hands and his face and the back of his neck, and he brushed them away with slow and automatic movements that did nothing to discourage them for more than a few seconds. The flies were persistent and patient and had all the time in the world, and they returned again and again to the same spots on his skin, drawn by the warmth and the moisture and the faint saltiness of his sweat. He had grown so accustomed to their attention that he barely noticed them anymore, the way he barely noticed the sound of the scythes or the calls of the crows or the feeling of the rough bark against his back, and their presence was just another thread in the dense fabric of the summer afternoon. The heat was the most insistent of all the presences, a heavy and smothering blanket that wrapped around him and made every breath feel thick and slow. The air beneath the elder was slightly cooler than the air in the open sun, but the difference was small and diminished as the day wore on and the heat accumulated, and the shade itself seemed to grow warm and stale. He would sit and feel the sweat form on his forehead and his upper lip, and run in slow trickles down his temples and into the hollows of his neck, and he would wipe it away with the back of his hand and feel the moisture smear across his skin and then be replaced almost immediately by new moisture that followed the same paths and required the same attention. The light that filtered through the elder leaves was a soft and shifting green, and it fell on the ground in patterns that moved and changed as the breeze stirred the branches and the sun continued its slow and patient journey across the sky. He watched the patterns without really seeing them, the way he watched everything now, with a kind of detached attention that registered the presence of things without engaging with them in any meaningful way. The patterns would shift and a patch of light would fall on his knee or his hand, and he would feel the warmth of it for a moment before the leaves shifted again, and the light moved on, and his skin returned to the relative cool of the shade. The process was slow and repetitive and endless, and it filled the hours without filling them, the way that water fills a vessel without changing its essential emptiness. He fell into a light doze without intending to, and without noticing the transition, the way that a boat drifts from its mooring and finds itself in the middle of the stream without any awareness of having moved. The doze was not sleep in any real sense, but was rather a suspension of attention, a state in which the sounds and sensations of the afternoon continued to reach him, but were received without being processed, flowing through his awareness like water through a sieve and leaving nothing behind. The crows continued their quiet depredations of the garden, and the sighs continued their distant rhythm, and the flies continued their patient explorations of his skin, and Aldric floated in the warm and hazy space between waking and sleeping, and felt nothing in particular, and thought nothing in particular, and was nothing in particular, and was nothing in particular. He would surface from the doze after an interval that might have been minutes, or might have been hours, and find that the world had changed in small and imperceptible ways while he was absent from it. The patterns of light on the ground had shifted to new positions, and the quality of the heat had altered slightly, and the angle of the shadows had lengthened or shortened according to the time of day. The crows might be gone, or might have returned, and the sound of the sighs might have stopped for the midday rest or resumed after it, and he would have no memory of any of these transitions, only the vague sense that time had passed and that he had not been present for its passing. A beetle crawled across the toe of his worn shoe, a small and glossy creature of a deep and iridescent green that caught the filtered light and reflected it back in tiny flashes. The beetle moved with a slow and deliberate purpose, navigating the rough terrain of the leather with its many legs and its waving antennae, and Aldric watched it with a concentration that was out of all proportion to the significance of the event. There was nothing else to watch and nothing else to do, and the beetle was a small point of focus in the vast and undifferentiated expanse of the afternoon, a tiny anchor that held his attention in place and prevented it from drifting away into the haze. He watched the beetle cross the toe of his shoe and move onto the packed earth beside it, and continue its journey towards some destination that only it could perceive, and when it disappeared into a small crack in the soil, he felt a faint and momentary loss, the absence of something that had briefly filled the emptiness. The long light of summer was a phenomenon that he had observed many times, but had never grown tired of observing. The way that the evening stretched on, and the sun seemed to hesitate at the horizon, as if reluctant to surrender the day to the darkness. The light of this hour was golden and thick, and seemed to have a physical weight, pressing down on the fields and the hedgerows and the distant line of the wood with a gentle and insistent gravity. The shadows of the elder branches stretched far across the garden and merged with the shadows of the cottage and the fence and the other trees, and the whole world was softened and unified by the warm and fading glow. The sounds of the hay meadow had stopped now, the workers having gathered their tools and made their way home for the evening meal and the rest that would prepare them for another day of the same labor. The crows had departed for their roosts in the high branches of the distant oaks, and the only sounds that remained were the soft and intermittent rustle of the elder leaves and the distant and mournful call of a dove from somewhere beyond the alder trees. The heat had begun to ease at last, not cooling in any real sense, but losing its oppressive edge, becoming something that could be endured without the constant awareness of enduring it. Aldric remained beneath the elder tree as the light continued to fade and the sky deepened from gold to amber to the soft and dusty blue of the summer twilight. He had no reason to move, and no desire to move, and no destination that required his presence, and the ground beneath the elder was as good a place as any to wait out the long and empty hours. The hunger that was always present now stirred in his stomach and reminded him that the evening meal would be served soon and that his portion would be waiting in its clay bowl, and the reminder was enough to eventually prompt him to rise, slowly and stiffly, and make his way back to the cottage. The cottage was warm with the accumulated heat of the day and the fire that his daughter-in-law had lit to cook the evening meal, and the air inside was thick and still and smelled of the same pottage that had been served 100 times before. He took his place on the stool by the hearth, and accepted his bowl, and ate his portion, and listened to the voices of the family as they talked about the hay harvest, and the weather, and the small events of the day. The children were tired from their own small contributions to the work, and their voices were subdued, and their eyelids were heavy. And Edric's voice was hoarse from the dust of the hay in the hours of labour, and the whole household seemed to be moving in a slower and more deliberate rhythm, conserving energy for the days that were still to come. He lay on his pallet that night and listened to the sounds of the cottage and the distant sounds of the summer night, the chirp of crickets and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, and the occasional soft hoot of an owl. The heat had not left the room, and the air was heavy and close, and the thin blanket was unnecessary, but he kept it over him anyway, because the weight of it was a familiar comfort. Sleep came slowly and reluctantly and was thin and easily disturbed, and he drifted in and out of awareness through the long and stifling hours, waiting for the grey light of dawn and the beginning of another day that would be the same as the day before and the same as the day after. The summer would continue in this way for many weeks, a long and unbroken stretch of heat and light and the heavy weight of empty time. He would sit beneath the elder tree and watch the patterns of light shift across the ground, and listen to the distant sound of the scythes and the crows and the flies, and he would doze and wake and doze again, and the days would pass without leaving any mark on his memory, a smooth and featureless expanse of time that was measured only by the slow growth of the vegetables in the garden and the gradual ripening of the grain in the distant fields. The hardship of the summer was not the hardship of cold or hunger or physical pain, but was instead the hardship of sheer and overwhelming uselessness, of being present in a world that was full of purpose and activity and having no part in any of it, of watching the light move across the ground and the shadows lengthen and shorten and lengthen again, of waiting for nothing and receiving nothing and being nothing more than a patient and silent observer of a life that had once been his to live. The cold returned to the cottage in the same way that it had always returned, not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual accumulation that began in the corners and along the floor and spread inward toward the hearth over the course of many weeks until the entire room was saturated with it, and no fire could do more than push it back a few feet from the flames. Aldric felt the cold first in his feet, the way he had felt it every autumn since he had grown old enough to feel such things, a slow and persistent chill that crept up from the packed earth floor and through the thin soles of his shoes and settled into the bones of his ankles and his shins and his knees. The cold was different from the cold of previous years in ways that were subtle and difficult to articulate, deeper somehow and more patient, as if it understood that his body was less capable of resisting it now and was content to take its time and claim what it wanted at its own unhurried pace. The stone on which his stool rested had been cold since the first frost of the season, a frost that had come early and hard and had turned the puddles in the lane to thin sheets of ice that cracked and splintered under the weight of passing feet. The stone was a single slab of grey rock that had been set into the floor near the hearth more years ago than anyone could remember, and it served as a foundation for the stool and a barrier between the sitter and the damp earth beneath. The stone absorbed the cold from the ground and held it, and radiated it upward through the legs of the stool and into the body of anyone who sat upon it. And Aldric had learned over the course of the past weeks that no amount of straw or folded cloth placed between himself and the stool could prevent the cold from finding its way into his flesh. The cold rose through him like water rising through dry soil, slow and steady and unstoppable, and it pulled in his hips and his lower back and the base of his spine and remained there even after he rose and moved to the pallet or to the doorway or to the patch of thin sunlight that fell through the window during the brief hours of midday. The walls of the cottage were another source of cold, a cold that was different in quality from the cold of the floor but no less persistent. The wattle and daub had always been porous and had always allowed the outside air to find its way inside through small gaps and cracks and the natural breathability of the materials. But the coming of winter had transformed this porosity from a minor inconvenience into a constant and inescapable presence. The cold that radiated from the walls was a dry cold rather than the damp cold of the floor, and it seemed to pull the warmth from the air and from the skin and from the very center of the body, leaving behind a sensation of brittleness and exposure that no amount of wool could fully address. Aldric had taken to sitting with his back to the fire and his face to the wall, because the warmth of the flames on his spine was more bearable than the cold of the wall on his face. But the arrangement meant that one side of his body was always warm while the other side was always cold, and the boundary between the two ran down the center of his chest, like a line drawn on a map. The cough had arrived with the first cold winds of late autumn, and had settled into his chest with the same quiet determination that the cold had settled into his bones. It was not a dramatic cough, not the deep and racking sound that he had heard from others over the years, the sound that signaled the beginning of a final illness and the approach of the end. His cough was shallow and dry and persistent, a small and irritating presence that lived at the back of his throat and announced itself at irregular intervals with a soft and papery sound that was more like a clearing of the throat than a true cough. The sound came and went throughout the day and was easily ignored during the hours when other sounds filled the cottage, the sounds of his daughter-in-law working, and the children playing, and the fire crackling, and the wind rustling the thatch. It was at night that the cough became impossible to ignore, when the other sounds faded, and the darkness pressed close, and the only thing to listen to was the rhythm of his own body, and the small and persistent interruption of the cough that broke that rhythm into uneven pieces. He would lie on his pallet in the corner and listen to the family sleeping, their breathing deep and regular, and full of the easy unconsciousness of the young and the healthy. Edric's breath was a low and steady rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest and fill the room with a reassuring presence. The sound of a body that had worked hard and would work hard again when the morning came. His wife's breath was softer and higher, a gentle rise and fall that was almost musical in its regularity, and the children's breath was quick and light, and punctuated by the occasional small sigh or murmur that spoke of dreams and growth and the busy inner life of the young. These sounds were a kind of music that Aldric had listened to for many years, first as a father, lying beside his own wife and children, and now as an old man lying alone in his corner, and the music had not changed even though his place in it had shifted from the center to the periphery. His own breath was a different kind of sound entirely, a careful and deliberate negotiation with the cold and heavy air of the winter night. Each breath required a small effort that he was conscious of in a way that he had never been conscious of breathing before, a slight tightening in his chest and a resistance in his throat that made the air feel thicker than it should and slower to enter his lungs. The breath would go in with a soft wheeze that was audible only to him, a faint and whispery sound that caught on something deep in his throat and emerged transformed, thinner and less substantial than the breath that had gone in. The breath would come out again with the same wheeze and sometimes with the cough, the dry and shallow sound that broke the rhythm of his breathing and sent a small ripple of disturbance through the stillness of his body. The cough did not wake the others because it was too soft and too familiar, a sound that had become part of the background of the night and was no more disturbing than the creak of the beam or the rustle of the thatch. He would lie in the darkness and feel the cough building in his throat like a small pressure that demanded release, and he would try to suppress it and fail, and then let it come, a short and papery sound that was swallowed by the larger darkness and left no trace behind. The cough would fade, and the wheeze would return, and the careful rhythm of his breathing would resume, and he would wait for the next cough, and the next, and the next, counting the intervals between them without meaning to, and measuring the slow progress of the night by their frequency. The wool blanket that covered him was thin and worn and had been patched in several places with pieces of different wool that did not quite match the original color or texture. The blanket was the same blanket that had covered him for more winters than he could remember, and it had grown thinner with each passing year as the fibers wore away and the moths found their way into the folds, and the simple friction of use reduced its substance by small and imperceptible increments. He would pull the blanket up to his chin and feel the rough texture of the wool against his skin, and the slight scratchiness that was both irritating and comforting in its familiarity. The blanket trapped a small amount of warmth close to his body, enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay, but not enough to make him truly warm, and the warmth was uneven and patchy, and seemed to shift and move as the night wore on, leaving one part of his body exposed, just as another part began to feel the benefit of the wool. The wind found its way under the door and through the gaps around the shutters, and into the room in thin and persistent streams that moved across the floor like invisible water. He could hear the wind outside, a low and constant sound that rose and fell in long and mournful cycles, and he could feel its presence inside as a slight movement of the air against his face, and a faint cooling of the skin that was exposed above the edge of the blanket. The wind carried with it the smell of the cold earth and the bare trees and the distant smoke from other cottages, and it brought also the faint and distant sounds of the winter night, the call of an owl and the bark of a fox, and the soft and endless rustle of the wind itself, moving through the hedgerows, and the bare branches and the dry and brittle stems of the dead grass. The wait for the grey dawn was the longest part of the night, the hours when the darkness seemed to deepen, and the cold seemed to intensify, and the cough seemed to come more frequently, and the distance between one breath and the next seemed to stretch and thin, until he was not sure whether he was breathing at all, or only imagining the rise and fall of his chest. He would lie in the darkness and listen to the sounds of the cottage and the wind and his own body, and he would think about the dawn and the light and the small relief that came when the grey rectangle appeared on the wall, and the world began to stir, and the long and empty hours of the night gave way to the long and empty hours of the night, gave way to the long and empty hours of the day. The dawn was not a promise of anything better, but was simply a change, a shift from one kind of waiting to another, and he welcomed it not because it brought comfort, but because it brought an end to the particular quality of the darkness that seemed to press against his eyes and fill his ears and wrap around his chest like a second blanket made of nothing but absence. The cough would ease as the light grew and the fire was stirred back to life and the sounds of the household filled the room, not because the cough was gone, but because the other sounds masked it and the movement of the day distracted him from its presence. He would rise from the pallet with the familiar protest of his joints and make his way to the stool by the hearth and sit and wait for the porridge and the bread and the long and undifferentiated stretch of hours that lay ahead. The cold would remain in his bones and the cough would remain in his throat, and the weight of the winter would press down on him with the same patient and indifferent gravity that it had always pressed down on the old and the weak and the useless. The days that followed were a slow and monotonous progression of the same sensations and the same sounds and the same small and meaningless variations that marked the passage of time without changing anything essential. The snow came and went and came again, a soft and silent accumulation that covered the yard and the lane and the distant field, and muffled the sounds of the world until the only thing that could be heard was the crackle of the fire and the dry and persistent sound of his own cough. The cough had become a companion now, a familiar and unwelcome presence that shared his body and his breath and his long and sleepless nights. And he had grown accustomed to it in the same way that he had grown accustomed to the ache in his joints and the chill in his bones and the thinness of his porridge. He thought about the end sometimes, not with fear or with longing, but with a kind of tired curiosity, the way one thinks about a journey that must be taken but has not yet been scheduled. The end was not something that he could see or feel or anticipate in any specific way, but it was present in the background of his awareness, like the cold that radiated from the stone floor, a constant and patient presence that asked nothing of him but was always there, waiting. The cough and the cold and the ache in his chest when he breathed too deeply were all small reminders of the journey that lay ahead, signposts that pointed in a direction he had not yet traveled, but would travel soon enough. He did not speak of these thoughts to anyone, because there was no one to speak to who would understand or care, and because the thoughts themselves were too vague and too personal to be shaped into words that another person could receive. The thoughts were simply there, a part of the long and silent hours of the night, and they drifted through his mind and returned and faded again, leaving no trace behind except a faint and lingering awareness of the cold stone beneath the stool and the cold earth beneath the floor and the long and patient grip of the winter that would hold him until the spring came, or until he slipped free of its grasp and into the deeper and more permanent cold that waited beneath the ground. The sound of the wind under the door was the sound of the world continuing without him, a low and constant whisper that spoke of movement and change and the endless turning of the seasons. He listened to it through the long hours of the night and felt the cold seeping upward through the stone and the wool and the thin and fragile barrier of his own skin, and he waited for the grey dawn and the small relief of the fire and the familiar sounds of the household waking around him. The cough came and went and came again, a dry and papery sound that marked the rhythm of his waiting, and the darkness pressed close, and the cold held him in its patient grip, and the night moved on in its slow and silent progress toward the light. The winter had settled into its deepest and most patient phase, the part of the season when the snow no longer fell in dramatic storms, but simply lay upon the ground as a permanent and unchanging presence, a white and silent blanket that covered the fields and the lanes and the roofs of the cottages and seemed to press the whole world into a stillness that was deeper than any stillness that came at other times of the year. The days were short and grey and the nights were long and black, and the only measure of time was the slow and steady consumption of the firewood that Edric brought in from the pile outside the door and stacked near the hearth in a neat and orderly arrangement. The pile diminished by small increments each day and was replenished by larger increments each week, and this cycle of depletion and renewal was one of the few things that marked the passage of time in a season that otherwise seemed to have no beginning and no end, and no particular direction. Aldric sat on his stool in the corner that had been his for so long that he could no longer remember a time when he had sat anywhere else, and he watched the fire and listened to the sounds of the cottage and felt the cold that was always there now, a cold that had moved beyond discomfort and become simply the background condition of his existence. The cough was still with him, but it had grown softer and less frequent, not because it was healing, but because his body seemed to have made a kind of peace with it, accepting the shallow and persistent irritation as a permanent feature rather than a temporary affliction. The cough came and went without urgency and without drama, a small and papery sound that was barely audible above the crackle of the fire and the rustle of the thatch and the other small sounds that filled the winter days. The family moved around him in their usual patterns, and he observed them with the same detached and patient attention that he gave to the fire and the light on the wall and the slow drift of ash that rose from the hearth and settled on every surface in a fine and grey dust. Edric came and went with his loads of firewood and his brief journeys to the byre to check on the animals, and his occasional trips to the village to exchange words with the other men about the weather and the supplies and the small concerns of a community that was waiting out the winter in the same way that Aldric was waiting out his own slow and patient decline. His daughter-in-law continued her endless round of tasks, the cooking, and the cleaning and the mending and the thousand small and unremarkable actions that kept the household functioning and the children fed and the fire burning and the darkness at bay. The children played and quarrelled and grew and learned, and their voices were the only sounds in the cottage that carried any real energy or variation, bright and sudden bursts of noise that rose and fell and were quickly absorbed by the heavy and patient silence of the winter. The boy, the younger of the two children, and the one who most resembled Edric in the shape of his face and the colour of his eyes, had been given a small task by his father, and was struggling with it in the corner near the door where the light was best and the cold was least. The task was a simple one, the kind of task that was given to children to teach them the skills they would need when they were older, and the work of the household fell to them, and it involved a length of twine and a broken tool handle and the tying of a knot that would hold the two pieces together until a proper repair could be made. The boy was perhaps 7 years old, or perhaps 8, and his fingers were small and clumsy and still learning the complex language of grip and tension and release that the tying of knots required. He held the twine in one hand and the handle in the other, and he frowned with concentration, and his tongue protruded slightly from the corner of his mouth. And he tried again and again to loop the twine around the handle and pull it tight in the way that his father had shown him. The twine slipped, and the loop came undone, and the handle fell to the floor with a soft and hollow thud, and the boy made a small sound of frustration and bent to retrieve it and began again. Aldric watched him from across the room, his old eyes finding the small and distant figure of his grandson, and following the movements of his hands with an attention that was more focused than anything he had felt in many weeks. The boy's struggle was familiar in a way that was deeper than memory, a recognition that came not from the mind, but from somewhere older and more fundamental, the place where the knowledge of how to teach and how to guide and how to pass on the small and essential skills of survival was stored. He had taught Edric to tie this same knot many years ago, but stood beside him and shown him the way the twine must cross over itself and then under and then through, the way the tension must be just right, not too tight and not too loose, the way the finished knot should look and feel and hold. The memory was clear and complete, and it rose up in him now with a quiet insistence that was impossible to ignore. He rose from the stool slowly and carefully, and with the familiar negotiation between his will and his body's reluctance, and he walked the few steps across the room to where the boy sat on the floor with the twine and the handle and the small frown of concentration. The walking was not easy, and his knees complained, and his back ached, and his breath came in the shallow and careful sips that had become his normal way of breathing. But the distance was short, and the purpose was clear, and his body obeyed him well enough to carry him to the boy's side. He lowered himself to the floor with a slowness that was almost ceremonial, feeling each joint and each muscle report its condition as he descended, and he settled onto the packed earth beside his grandson and looked at the tangle of twine and the smooth wood of the handle and the small and earnest face of the boy, who looked back at him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. The boy did not speak, and Aldric did not speak, because the thing that was happening between them did not require words and would not have been improved by them. The old man reached out his hands, the hands that were swollen and spotted and curved inward at the fingers, the hands that could no longer grip a plough or mend a net or perform any of the tasks that had once defined his place in the world, and he placed them gently over the boy's hands where they held the twine and the handle. The boy's hands were warm and smooth and full of the soft and unformed potential of youth, and they rested beneath Aldric's cold and gnarled fingers with a trust that required no justification and no explanation. The old hands did not take over and did not push the young hands aside, but simply rested there, a light and guiding presence that suggested rather than commanded, that showed rather than told. The twine moved beneath their combined grip, crossing over itself and then under and then through, and the loop tightened and held and became a knot that was neither too tight nor too loose, a knot that would serve its purpose and hold the broken handle until the proper repair could be made. The boy's fingers followed the guidance of the old fingers and learned the feeling of the correct tension and the correct motion, and when the knot was finished, the boy looked at it and then looked at Aldric, and a small and satisfied smile appeared on his face. The smile was brief and unself-conscious, and it faded quickly as the boy returned his attention to the handle and the twine and began to tie another knot on his own, his fingers moving with a new and tentative confidence that had not been there before. Aldric withdrew his hands and let them rest on his thighs and watched the boy work. The second knot was not as neat as the first, and it took longer and required more adjustments. But it held, and the boy made a small sound of satisfaction and began a third knot without being asked. The old man sat on the cold floor beside his grandson and felt the warmth of the boy's presence, and the quiet and unremarkable transfer that had taken place between them, a transfer that required no words and no ceremony and no acknowledgement from anyone else. The knot was just a knot, and the handle was just a handle, and the twine was just twine, but the thing that had passed from the old hands to the young hands was something else entirely, something that could not be named or measured, but was as real as the cold that rose from the floor and the fire that burned in the hearth and the slow and patient turning of the seasons. The boy finished his work and gathered the twine and the handle and stood up and walked away to show his father what he had done, and Aldric remained on the floor for a moment longer, feeling the cold seep upward through his thin clothing and into his flesh and bones. The cold was the same cold that had been there all winter, and it would be there until the spring came, or until he was no longer there to feel it, but for this small and fleeting moment it seemed less important than it had before, less insistent and less demanding. He pushed himself up from the floor with the slow and careful movements that had become his only way of moving, and he made his way back to the stool by the hearth and sat down and let his gaze rest on the flames. The fire crackled and popped and sent a small shower of sparks up into the darkness of the chimney, and the sound was the same sound that it had always been, a sound that had asked nothing and promised nothing and simply existed. The light from the flames fell on his face and his hands and the rough surface of his woolen tunic, and the warmth of it reached him in small and intermittent waves that alternated with the cold draughts from the door and the walls. The warmth was not enough to chase away the cold that lived in his bones, but it was enough to remind him that warmth existed and that he was still capable of feeling it, and this reminder was a small and quiet comfort in a world that had grown very small and very quiet and very still. The sounds of a cottage continued around him, the murmur of voices and the clink of the pot and the rustle of the thatch and the soft and endless whisper of the wind outside the shuttered window. The boy's voice rose above the others for a moment as he showed his father the knotted handle, and Edric's voice answered with a low and approving rumble, and then the voices settled back into their usual patterns, and the afternoon moved on in its slow and patient way toward the evening, and the meal, and the long and silent hours of the night. Aldric sat on his stool and listened to it all, and felt the warmth of the fire on one side of his face, and the cold of the room on the other, and he thought about the knot, and the boy's hands, and the small and quiet transfer that had taken place between them. The thread that held things together was not a thing that could be seen or touched or measured, but it was real, and it was present, and it had passed through him and into the boy in the same way that it had passed through his father and into him, and through his father's father and into his father. The thread was not strength, and it was not wisdom, and it was not any of the things that the world valued or rewarded, but it was the thing that remained when everything else was stripped away, the patient and persistent capacity to guide and to show and to be present without demanding anything in return. The plough was gone, and the work was gone, and the strength was gone, and the voice that could carry over the wind was gone, but the thread was still there, and it had found its way from his old and useless hands to the young and capable hands of the boy, and this was enough. The snow began to fall again outside the shuttered window, a soft and silent accumulation that added another layer to the white and patient blanket that covered the world. The sound of the snowfall was no sound at all, but was rather an absence of sound, a deepening of the quiet that wrapped around the cottage and held it close. The fire burned and the shadows danced on the walls, and the old man sat on his stool and watched the flames and listened to the silence, and felt the thread that connected him to the past and the future, and the long and unbroken chain of people who had sat by fires and tied knots and passed on the small and essential things that could not be written down or spoken aloud. The evening came, and the meal was served, and the bowls were filled and emptied, and the family settled into their places for the night. Aldric lay on his pallet in the corner and pulled the thin blanket up to his chin and listened to the sounds of the cottage settling around him, the creak of the beam and the rustle of the thatch and the soft, unregular breathing of the others. The cough came once and then was still, and the cold pressed close, and the darkness held him in its patient grip, and he closed his eyes and let the long and slow current of the night carry him toward the grey dawn, and the next day, and the next, and the next, the thread would hold. It had always held, and it would continue to hold long after he was gone, and the stool was empty, and the corner was just a corner again. The boy would grow and learn and tie knots of his own, and one day he would sit by a different fire in a different cottage, and place his old and gnarled hands over the young and clumsy hands of another child, and the thread would pass through him and continue on its way, quiet and unremarkable and utterly essential. The snow fell, and the fire burned, and the old man slept, and the world moved on in its slow and patient way toward the spring and the summer and the autumn and the winter, carrying them all along together in the long and gentle current of the seasons. The story ends here, not with a conclusion, but with a continuation, the same continuation that has always been and will always be. The hearth glows and the ashes fall, and the thread holds, and the old man rests in the corner where he has always rested, a part of the room and a part of the fire, and a part of the long and patient history of people who lived and worked and grew old and passed on, the only things that could be passed on. The silence is deep, and the night is long, and the snow falls without sound, and there is nothing more to tell, and nothing more that needs telling.